Sometimes there are cases that are so evil and twisted, ones that don't make sense to those of us that are compassionate, loving people with a conscience. But there are monsters walking among us that seem to lack even the slightest bit of humanity. This is one of those stories. It'll leave you asking why and questioning whether you can truly know anyone, because some humans have truly evil minds. Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel, and if you've never been here before, I'm Kimbyrleigha. It's nice to finally meet you. I just want to say thank you so much. I'm almost at 500,000 subscribers, which I had never imagined would happen on this channel, so I'm forever grateful. It's all because of you, and because I am reaching this new milestone, I'm going to be trying some new things on this channel, and one of the things I saw my friend Brittany do, or as you probably know, Broderstein, she has her own true crime channel here on YouTube. She was putting out marathons of content. Now, I'm already a channel that likes to do 2 to 3 hour videos. That's what I'm known for, but I can't always do them every week. So I wanted to do something new, so we're going to be doing a marathon. But before we get into this long video today, I want to thank our sponsor, who has been a very loyal one from the beginning supporting this channel, and that is PDS Debt. Now, many of you, like me, have benefited from the services that PDS Debt offers. It goes beyond just debt management. They empower you to take back control of your finances. They truly understand your unique situation and design customized plans tailored just to you. PDS Debt has customized options for anyone struggling with credit cards, personal loans, collections, or medical bills. We're remodeling a home from the 1940s, and I have to tell you, the charges have been adding up, and then we'll be moving, so there are even more expenses, and PDS Debt can help. And the best part is there's no minimum credit score required. Whether your credit is fair or it needs improvement, PDS Debt can help you save more, pay off what you owe faster, and finally start putting money back where it belongs, which is in your savings account. So make this year the year you take control of your debt. Get a free debt analysis right now at pdsdebt.com/Kimber. That's pdsdebt.com/Kimber. It only takes 30 seconds. And I just want to thank PDS Debt for being a loyal sponsor of this video. Now, let's get into the cases. As women, unfortunately, most of us know the statistics. 1 in 4 women will be the victim of severe intimate partner violence in their lifetime. Over 1/3 of all women killed in the United States are killed by their partners. It's an epidemic. But while many of us know the stats, it's all too easy to miss the warning signs when you're in love with someone, when you want to believe the best in them. That's why we depend on courts and law enforcement to make sure that perpetrators of domestic violence are treated with the same severity as other violent criminals. But time and time again, they're not. Time and time again, they slip through the cracks. And time again, men that hurt the people they say they love are given another chance to cause harm. And this is one of those stories. This is a story of a man proven to be dangerous, who was given another chance and used that chance to commit one of the most horrific crimes imaginable. I gotta warn you, this story is going to be a hard one to listen to, but it's an important one. You'll hear a lot about a woman named Faith Green, and what Faith wants more than anything is for women to learn the signs of partner-related abuse so they can identify them early when there's still a chance to escape. While getting out is often the most hardest part, Faith is hopeful that if more women have the knowledge that she lacked, there will be less stories like hers. She has dedicated her life to this pursuit, and I hope that this episode will help spread her message just a little bit further. Our case today begins with Faith Green. Faith is the daughter of a pastor, and church was always very important to her family. They attended every Sunday and knew the congregation well. When Faith was only 14 years old, she actually developed a little crush on a parishioner there who was 10 years older than her. The two of them would sit on a bench in the church and talk after the service, just chatting and discussing scripture. But then one day, the parishioner just disappeared. But years passed, and Faith never saw him again. Her crush became a thing of the past, and she met another man, Chadney Allen, and the two of them fell in love and had 2 children. The first was Chadney Vincent Allen Jr., named after his father. He was born on August 7th, 1997, and 2 years later, on April 25th, 1999, Kiera Whitney Allen was born. While Chadney Sr. and Faith's relationship didn't work out in the end, their 2 children would grow up to be ambitious, engaging young adults. Faith described Chadney Jr. as quiet and introverted, but also handsome, articulate, and smart. She said he always gave her big hugs, and Chadney had dreams to make movies, and he eventually attended and graduated from a media arts school in pursuit of that goal. Kiera, on the other hand, was a lot like her mom. From a young age, she always was very social, and she loved making new friends and going places. Faith said that she tried to be into anything and everything, and as a child, Kiera wrote in her diary that she wanted to be a singer, a veterinarian, a pediatrician, a fashion designer, and a business owner. But as she grew up, her real passion emerged, and she decided she definitely wanted to be a doctor. In high school, Kiera was a cheerleader, a member of the student newspaper, an honor student, and a member of the National Honor Society. Even after Faith split with her dad, Chadney and Kiera remained the center of Faith's universe. Faith worked as a caretaker, and her coworker, Carrie Welchie, remembered that her kids were her everything. It's always been about Faith's kids. So when a man from Faith's past reappeared, instantly charming her and her children, Faith thought that she had been sent a blessing. When Faith was in her 30s, a decade and a half after her childhood crush had disappeared from church, he suddenly reappeared, sitting in the pew in front of her on a Sunday. Faith recognized him instantly. She approached him after the service, saying she had butterflies, just like she did as a kid. She said at first he didn't recognize her. Of course not. It had been a long time. But when she introduced herself, he laughed and said she was all grown up, which she was. His name was Gregory Green. Gregory was born on December 10th, 1966, a full 10 years before Faith. But he too was raised in a religious family, and their Christian faith was something that united Faith and Gregory. Gregory had been married once before to a woman named Tanya Clayton, but at the time he met Faith, Tanya was out of the picture. Faith had, of course, heard some rumors around the parish about Greg. Her father, the pastor, worked with parolees, and through his work, had reconnected with Greg and encouraged him to return to the church. Faith's father reassured Faith that while Greg had been incarcerated, he had only acted in self-defense, and that after his release, he was trying to turn over a new leaf. Faith never heard anything contrary to this around the church. Greg was released early because of his clean prison record, his excellent work history in prison, and the courses he took while he was there to help him see the error of his ways and prepare him to successfully re-enter into the world. Faith wanted to give Greg a chance to start over, so she took him as he was, and he was very charming. She said he acted like such a gentleman. He was good with her 2 children, and soon the two started to see each other more and more, and eventually Greg moved in with Faith, Chadney, and Kiera. Greg got a job at the Detroit Metro Airport and started to put his life back together. Faith didn't ask him about his time in prison or what he had done to end up there because she said she wanted to trust that people could change. He was trying to make a better life for himself now, and she wanted to aid and encourage him in those efforts. But as time passed, Faith started to get this creeping suspicion that something wasn't right with Greg. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. We have to trust our intuition. A woman's intuition is usually never wrong. Faith tried to look up his record and see if she could find any information online about what he had done, but she wasn't able to find anything. But finally, when that feeling of not being right became too much to bear, Faith asked Greg about what happened to land him in prison. Greg reiterated what Faith had heard around the church, that he had only done what he had to do in self-defense. He said he had gotten into a fight with his wife, Tanya, at the time. He told Faith that Tanya had been hitting him and punching him, so he said he pushed her away, but that when she fell, she hit her head and she died. It was a horrible accident, an accident which had cost him his wife and 16 years in prison. Faith took Greg at his word. She said she thought he was telling the truth because Greg seemed so laid back and quiet and just the perfect gentleman. The Greg that she knew would never hurt a fly. Faith didn't want to overwhelm Greg by making him continue to talk about this terrible accident, so she never asked him more about it. She didn't want to push him because she felt like he really wanted to move on and put it out of his mind. Plus, Faith trusted in our institutions. She said, I also felt like if it was really that bad, they wouldn't have let him out. But as we'll see throughout this case, our institutions often fail and they often fail women when it comes to adequate vigilance, record keeping, and repercussions of domestic violent offenders. However, even after Faith got this explanation from Greg, that lingering feeling that something was off never went away. She thought that his explanation might fix things, but instead, her trepidation started to grow. At first, she thought Greg was quiet because he was shy, and that with time, he would come out of his shell. But this didn't happen. Faith started to think that it was odd how little he talked, and his silence only agitated the gut feeling she was having to get out. On top of all of his silence, Greg also had strange mood swings. Faith recalled one moment where he was sitting on the couch, and then he got up, went into another room, and came back a totally different person, in a totally different mood, like a switch had been flipped. And Faith said that this was the moment she started to get the sense that there was something going on inside of Greg that she could never understand. Finally, she decided that she had to trust her intuition. She broke things off with Greg, and she moved out. But as fate would have it, this wasn't the end of Faith and Greg's story. Soon after the two of them split, Faith found out she was pregnant with Greg's child. So the pair reconnected for the sake of the baby. How many times have we heard this? It's actually very common. Greg moved back in so they could be a happy family together. Faith said she was committed to giving Greg a real second chance. She said that Greg definitely seemed like he was ready to commit. He seemed happy and ready to do this with her. But I think most of us know that the baby band-aid, you know what I'm talking about, having a baby to try to save your relationship, it doesn't usually work. Couples may experience a brief honeymoon period when the new child arrives, but soon, the added responsibilities, taking care of a newborn, all of those pressures just add to the pre-existing problems. Faith and Greg's daughter, Coy, was born on October 28th, 2010. For a brief period, things were better. Greg was happy to be a dad, and Coy was a bright light in their house. Faith said that Coy loved ballet, cheerleading, and dressing up in her mom's high heels. In fact, things were so good that Faith and Greg decided to get married. So I guess things were working out at first. Tying the knot in less than 2 months after Coy's birth in December of 2010. But this happy period didn't last very long. Soon after the wedding, Faith felt Greg was detaching again. He had told Faith he always wanted kids, but Faith worried that now that he had his own child, he was realizing that maybe he didn't want kids after all. She wasn't sure exactly what was going on with Greg, but she felt sure that something was going on. However, Greg refused to open up to her. Instead, his silence began to give way to angry outbursts. Faith still remembered the very first time she saw Greg get really angry. She asked him to simply put up some new curtains in their house. But as he was working, he began to get very frustrated with the process, cussing and screaming. And to be fair, if anyone has ever tried to build, let's say, IKEA furniture, I'm just going to say, cussing and yelling, that's normal. And it doesn't necessarily raise a red flag immediately to me or probably anyone. And that's what Faith thought. She noticed Greg was getting angry, but she thought that he was just frustrated with the curtain rod, which was pretty understandable. However, Faith's daughter, Kira, interpreted Greg's actions that day very differently. Kira kept asking her mom, "Ma, why is he so angry?" And she seemed afraid of Greg. Clearly, she had never seen a man act like this before, and it scared her, which is also fair. After this incident, Kira's dislike of Greg continued to grow, but she stopped voicing her concerns to her mom. Instead, she started to record her thoughts in her journal. In her diary, she wrote, "I don't like Greg. Mom's obsessed with him. Something doesn't seem right with him. I don't want to call him dad. It's like everyone loves him but me. It just doesn't seem like he's I can't even explain it." Just like Faith had in the beginning of their relationship, Kira was beginning to get a bad feeling about Greg. She was young and couldn't quite define the feeling, but her intuition was telling her something wasn't right with this man. Like I said, intuition is usually not wrong. But unfortunately, before Kira could voice these concerns to her mom, Faith found out she was pregnant again. On September 5th, 2012, Kaylee was born. Kaylee and Coy quickly became partners in crime, doing everything together. Kaylee enjoyed playing outside and fell in love with ballet and cheerleading just like her big sister Coy. But Greg was not happy about the addition of yet another child to their family. This time, There was no honeymoon period. Greg became moody and distant from Kaylee from the moment that he saw her in the hospital. Faith actually confronted her husband and asked him what was wrong. Why was he acting like this? He responded that he had wanted a boy. Okay, as a mom of 2 girls, I can understand gender disappointment. It is a real thing. But can you imagine for a second, still being in the hospital after going through labor and your husband is complaining that he didn't get his boy? I think most people would think it's just a little bit insensitive. Faith tried to set Greg straight. She told him he should be happy. They had a healthy baby, and that's all that should matter. Kaylee needed both of their love, no matter what gender she was. And then Faith decided to give Greg some space. She was hoping that he would gradually come around to Kaylee and go back to being the Greg that she loved, the one who had been so kind to Chadney and Kiera when they first met, the one who eagerly accepted Coy's birth. But instead, Greg began to take his anger out on the family, venting his own frustrations in increasingly terrifying outbursts. Faith had already seen Greg lose his temper with a curtain rod, but she had never seen him turn that anger on one of their children. Until one terrible morning. Kaylee came toddling into the room holding some bread and butter because she wanted a sandwich. Kaylee was just a little more than a baby at the time, so Faith told her to take the bread and butter back to the kitchen, and she would come out in a second to help her get some food. However, in the kitchen, Greg noticed that Kaylee had accidentally smushed the loaf of bread by carrying it around. She was just a little girl. I can imagine that exact thing happening. Instead of just correcting the baby or maybe even just letting it go, he slapped Kaylee really hard on the back. And Faith still remembers the sound, how loud it was. It was ringing through the kitchen. Faith immediately jumped to her daughter's defense and went after Greg. But despite her reprimands, Greg refused to apologize. Throughout the fight, Coy just sat there frozen. Faith said that Coy was really scared of Greg and hated when his temper came out. Coy started biting her nails, which Faith thought was likely a way to cope with her nerves and her fear. Seeing one of her daughters hurt and the other one terrified, Faith knew she had to get away from Greg. But it wasn't as easy as simply getting up and leaving. Faith was responsible for 4 children. She had to have a plan, and she had to have money. So she started saving, slowly building a nest egg that would allow her to escape this violent man. But as she worked towards this goal, Greg's behavior got worse and worse, and one day, Faith returned home to find all the knobs on the stove turned on. The entire house smelled of gas. Horrified, she quickly turned off all the burners. Greg was supposed to be watching the kids. How could he have let this happen? And Faith soon got her answer. She found Greg sitting calmly on the couch. At first, he tried to deny, saying perhaps one of the children had been playing with the stove and left the burners on. But as Faith pressed him, he told his wife that he had left the gas on because he wanted to take his own life. Faith was, of course, shocked, and she asked Greg what was so bad that he didn't want to be here anymore. But as usual, Greg was just silent, and he refused to offer any explanation. The urgent need to leave was only growing, but Faith still didn't have the means to do so. I can imagine this, actually. I think many of us have been in a situation similar, that you can't get out. But if you can even think about how hard it would be for Faith in this moment, knowing that Greg was so close to breaking that if she hadn't come home when she did, the house might have blown up with the children inside. To know that you're in a dangerous situation, but not have the means to leave is a horrible predicament. So many people are quick to blame victims, always asking the same unhelpful, accusatory questions. Why didn't you just leave? But it's important to remember the logistical, the psychological, and the financial barriers that victims must often overcome before they can get out of a home like this. But despite all these barriers, Faith kept working towards that end goal. A little while later, in a moment that Faith had hoped would be a brief moment of happiness amidst all of the stress and growing tension, the couple took their 2 youngest children, Coy and Kaylee, to a water park, and the family was having a surprisingly good time. It's like that sometimes. It ebbs and it flows. There's good times that are good and bad times that are really bad. When they all sat down to eat, Greg was looking at his family, And he actually said, what if it was just the four of us? What he meant by that was, what if Kiera and Chadney didn't exist anymore? Of course, Faith got upset, reminding Greg that even though Kiera and Chadney were not his biological children, they were just as much a part of his family as Coy and Kaylee. Faith knew that Kiera and Greg did not get along. She always spoke her mind, and as she'd gotten older, she disapproved more and more of Greg, and it had become very obvious she felt that way. But Faith was very surprised to hear Greg express such a negative sentiment towards Chadney. Up until this point, she had thought the father and son, even though they were not biological, had a really special bond. Chadney really looked up to his stepfather. After this conversation, a new fear developed in Faith. Not only that Greg might hurt her or her children, but that he might try to take away Coy and Kaylee. Even though Faith wasn't able to leave at this point, she was worried enough to try something new. Maybe, if she couldn't leave, she could find a way to force Greg to leave. So in February of 2013, Faith filed a petition for a restraining order. And sometimes this can make things much worse. She had been through so much, and she thought that maybe law enforcement might be able to help her and her family so that they could get out of this dangerous situation. In the restraining order, she described an incident in which Greg tried to kick her out of the house. She mentioned how he kicked things, he threatened her, he jumped at her, and said if she didn't leave the house, things were going to get ugly. She even described how he kicked the couch the baby had been sleeping on. And Faith was so scared throughout this entire fight, but she refused to leave because she didn't want Greg there alone with her kids. She was worried that if she left, Greg would never let her back in. However, despite these alarming details relayed in this petition, Faith did not get the help or the relief that she hoped for. The Wayne County Circuit Court dismissed her petition without a hearing, saying her claims were not sufficient enough to merit the order. They did not search Greg's criminal record before dismissing the case, and if they had, they likely would have realized how desperately Faith really did need this restraining order. According to records, 7,437 domestic-related petitions were filed in Wayne County that year, with 4,900 of them being for personal protection orders. All of these thousands of cases were handled by 12 judges. That's right, 12. With so many petitions and so few eyes reading them, judges would explain that there just wasn't enough time to give each petition the careful consideration it deserved. One Wayne County Circuit Judge, Kathleen McCarthy, explained what working in the circuit court was like. She said the criminal court was so overwhelmed that absent an aggravated stalking charge, a lot of these hearings are resolved with pleas under advisement, and you wait 60 or 90 days just to see what happens. There are 52 cities in Wayne County. It's the 8th largest court in the country. So Judge McCarthy said, should we be able to do all that stuff? Yes, but it's just not a reality. Nicole Beverly, a clinical social worker and DV advocate and survivor, explained that often it costs the victims so much to reach out for help that if they're rebuffed by the system, they may never reach out again. This was certainly the case with Faith. After her failed attempt to receive a personal protection order, she never filed for a restraining order again. Instead, she attempted to deal with the escalating situation on her own. After the failed petition, Greg only became more violent. He would often get in Faith's face, backing her up against a wall. He would wake Faith up in the middle of the night, using sleep deprivation as a form of torture. One night, Faith went to sleep with sharpened pencils in her robe, just in case he tried to attack her in her sleep. She said it was just one thing after the next. And the more it happened, the more she would think that this is not what I signed up for. And she couldn't stay. She needed to leave. And then finally, on the children's last day of school, Faith's plan came together. She finally had enough money. The kids were done with school. It was time. She and the kids packed everything they needed from the house in only 2 hours, and they got out. From the car, Faith called Greg. She told him they moved out and she wanted a divorce. And Greg was livid. He hung up on her, turned off all their phones, but it didn't matter. She was out. She and her children were safe. She officially filed for divorce on October 11th, 2013. But of course, this didn't mean that Greg was out of their lives completely. He was still Coy and Kaylee's father, and as such, he still wanted to be able to see them. So Faith agreed to occasionally meet up in public places. But for the first couple meetings, Greg selected the locations, and he picked isolated spots where there were no other people. Faith began to think that he might be doing this intentionally, maybe even planning to take Coy and Kaylee during one of these scheduled visitations. She insisted that they start meeting at a local shopping mall. Greg surprisingly agreed to this. In fact, as their separation went on for the first year and then into the second year, Greg seemed to change for the better. He was more communicative, he was calmer, more patient, and even more loving. He said he really wanted to be a family again. All right. I can sense everyone's dread in this moment because I feel it too. And I felt it when I was researching this case. This was the moment where I wanted to shout, don't do it. Don't get back with this man. Don't listen to him. He's lying to you. And in retrospect, listening to this case now, it may seem obvious to all of us. But what's important to remember is that this is one of the hallmarks of these kind of relationships. It's manipulation. Men like this are often good liars, great manipulators, and throughout the years of psychological torment, they've convinced their victims that no one will ever love them the way they do. Just before the divorce was finalized, Faith took Greg back, and they moved in together again. But I just want all of us to remember that at this point, Greg had been in Faith's life for over 5 years. That's a long time to work his way into her psyche, to manipulate her mind. And Faith may have escaped his physical abuse in their first 2 years of separation, but escaping the psychological prison that he had built for her was much more difficult. And in the end, no one would have predicted the evil that Greg was truly capable of. Only a few months passed before it became clear to Faith that Greg hadn't really changed at all. She said that he was either high or low. There was no balancing with him. So either he was super happy or super angry. And Faith knew that she had made a mistake, and she prepared once again to leave Greg, this time for good. She filed divorce again. About a month after the second divorce filing, on the night of September 20th, 2016, Greg woke up Faith in the middle of the night and dragged her into the living room. What follows is one of the most horrific and heartless things that I think I have covered, at least in a while. It's going to get really sad. And I apologize. But I also think it's important to know the details to fully understand what Faith and her children went through that night, the torture that Greg put them through. When Faith got to the living room, her son Chadney was already there, and at gunpoint, Greg made Chadney tie Faith's hands behind her back. She was completely quiet. She might have been in shock. In that moment, she thought, if she could just be calm, then maybe Greg would be calm too. But he had a gun. And she didn't want to do anything that might trigger one of his violent outbursts when a firearm was involved. Next, Greg put zip ties on Chadney too. Faith thought at this point that Greg was just restraining them so he could take the girls. He had made that comment at the water park about just wanting it to be the 4 of them, so maybe he was following through on that threat. Greg then led Kiera into the room, zip-tying her as well. And next, he ordered the 3 of them to go down to the basement. Faith told her terrified children to do what he said. She wanted to avoid Greg using a gun at all costs. In that moment, cooperation felt like the only way to ensure their safety. So the 3 of them walked down to the basement, and there, per Greg's orders, they laid on the ground. He duct taped their wrists and their ankles, rendering them completely immobile. And then he left the basement and went into the garage. Faith couldn't hear or see what he was doing in the garage, but while he was gone, she and Chadney attempted to remove their zip ties. There was a phone in the basement, and they thought if they could just free one hand, even just one hand, they could call 911. But unfortunately, Greg came back too quickly. This time, he turned the lights off, and Faith could see just a little bit of light because the laundry room light was still on. Greg didn't yell. He spoke calmly. He said he didn't want his girls to be raised by anyone in Faith's family, and he didn't want them to be influenced by Kiera. He told Faith she was going to suffer for what she did to his girls. Then Faith heard the gun cock. He asked his wife, "Do you want to see the girls?" And she nodded yes. And the next thing she knew, Greg shot Kiera 2 times. Kiera screamed and looked at her mother while she was spitting up blood and gurgling. Then she turned her head, but Faith could still hear the gurgling and the gasping for air. She said she could never forget that sound. that feeling of helplessness, watching her own daughter die in front of her, unable to even move to save her or even comfort her. And next, shockingly, Greg shot Chadney. And all Chadney said was ow, and then he rolled over and he never moved again. And finally, Greg turned the gun on Faith. But he wasn't going to give her a quick death. He had already stated that he wanted to cause her pain. He tortured her, hurting her, but not enough for her to die. First, he shot her in the foot. And at this point, Faith was in shock, and she didn't even feel anything. Then Greg approached Faith and slashed her face from side to side with a box cutter. She said she saw the blood come out of her and it felt warm as it poured down her face and started to soak her clothing, but still, she felt no pain. She was in shock, and all she knew was this horrible moment was happening, and this was her reality. With Kira and Chadney dead on the ground and Faith lying in a growing pool of her own blood, Greg put the gun down and picked up the phone. Calmly, this man called the police, and he told 911, "I killed some people in my family. I shot Kira and Chadney, my 2 stepkids. They're both dead." And about Faith, he said, "She was the only one that survived. I cut her up. I cut her face." Then he put down the phone and he left the basement. And when the police arrived at that house at 1:20 in the morning, Greg was standing in the driveway with his hands in the air. And Faith said that although she now knows it was only a few minutes, the moments that she spent on that floor waiting for the police were the longest moments of her entire life. Finally, she heard knocking on the door and a voice calling out to her asking if anyone was in there. She shouted back that she was in there, in the basement, but she couldn't move because she was tied up. Police then descended into the basement and they said the scene that they saw was the worst they had seen in their entire careers. They immediately began freeing Faith from the duct tape and the zip ties and trying to stop her heavy bleeding. Faith remembers it taking them a very long time to find the source of her bleeding because there was just so much blood. Finally, paramedics were there to try to stabilize her and get her into an ambulance, and then she was rushed to the hospital. But the basement wasn't the only crime scene in that house. When they went upstairs, the police found Coy and Kaylee lying apparently asleep in their beds. But when they looked closer, they could see that the 2 little girls were dead. They tried to administer CPR, but the girls were gone. Greg had put his 2 children in the car, used a tube of pipe in the car's exhaust into the car window, and then waited until the 2 little girls succumbed to carbon monoxide poisoning, and then he carried them back up to their beds and laid them down as if they were merely asleep. At the police station, Greg told police they were asleep and everything. I just comforted them and I made sure they were comfortable, and then I just laid them down and I left them. And then I checked on them. I checked on them several times and they looked peaceful. This is so sick. Like, think about a father doing that. And this declaration alone gives us some insight about just how disturbed Greg was. To try to explain his actions in a way like this, stating that his daughters were asleep, comfortable, and peaceful when he stole their lives from them, is just sick. And it only got worse. In the long, rambling, taped police interview, and I'm going to play some of it for you, Greg unraveled, sharing with police what he had done and his perverse reasoning behind his actions. He started off by saying, "I can't believe I did this. But I knew once it got to a certain point, I couldn't turn back." Let's listen to some of this now.
I knew once I got to a certain point, I couldn't turn back. I said, look, I can't change it now. I can't turn back. This is it. So I'm sorry I have to go through with this.
Did you intend on killing Faith?
No, because I wanted her to see what she did and to live with it. It's like I gotta live with it.
There's no way for a reasonable person to understand the unreasonable. He mentioned this several times that he got to this point and he knew he couldn't turn back. As if this was a way to somehow explain why he took not 1, not 2, not 3, but 4 innocent lives in one night. At various points, he did express remorse, but this remorse was always tinged with the sentiment that he had no choice, that he had to do what he had to do. At one point, he said a lot of people might be shocked, but he knew he was going to do something. And that was it. And he kept saying, I'm sorry, how could I have done this? And he did admit that no one would understand and that he was going to have nightmares and bad thoughts and dreams. And it was going to be really hard for him to bear. Can you even imagine him thinking that he was going to have to deal with things when he just killed an entire family, innocent children? At the very least, Greg did seem aware in the interview that there was no hope of escaping the consequences of his actions. He kept saying, I'm willing to accept the consequences because I feel like I deserve it. I'm going away, and it'll be for the rest of my life. This time, there won't be any getting out. I know that now, and I just want to turn myself in. I know I'm going to prison for the rest of my life, and I deserve that. But by far the most horrible part of the interview was when Greg began to blame his wife, Faith, for what he had done. In that moment, Faith was in the hospital suffering near fatal injuries and unimaginable shock and grief. And Greg had the nerve to try to pin his actions on her. This convinced me more, despite all of his apologies, that this man felt no real emotions. He had no remorse about what he had done. I don't think he's capable of it. And how can there be remorse if there's no accountability? He said, this is my wife, and thanks to her, I did what I did. She's a piece of work. Just keep pushing the issue. I wanted her to see what she did. I felt overwhelmed, and anger turned into hatred. Towards the end of the interview, he added, I know that people are going to say, if you loved her, if you love them, how could you do it? Tell me your thoughts, because I know a lot of you, if you were alone with him, you'd probably put him out of his misery very quickly with no questions asked. But I'm sure police were just as moved by Greg's misery as I am. Not at all. While he struggled through a police interview, Faith was struggling to hold on to her life in the hospital. Unfortunately, the nightmare was still far from over for Faith. When she woke up in the hospital, it was to the heartbreaking news that her other two children, Coy and Kaylee, who she thought were still alive, had also been murdered by Greg. Faith said that at first, she couldn't even process the information. Hospital staff had to repeat it for her several times before it finally sunk in. All 4 of her children were gone. And as a mom who just had a baby, I think about all that I had to go through, all that this woman had to go through 4 times. The pregnancies, the happy thoughts of bringing these children into the world, the labor, raising them. It's unbelievable. And there's nothing to hold on to anymore. Faith was brought in a wheelchair to the bodies of Coy and Kaylee. And she said that she just remembered Coy was sleeping, just sleeping there with her glasses on, but she was so cold. Faith held her daughter's hand. Coy had just celebrated her 4th birthday, and now she was gone. And then Faith was rolled over to Kaylee. And tragically, Kaylee had been the last to die. So her little body was still warm when her mom touched her skin. And Faith said, I just never wanted to wake up. I wanted to sleep and never wake up again. I couldn't do anything but cry. Because Greg knew that she loved her kids more than she loved him. He did this to her. Her kids were her world. So he wanted to take that away from her so he could hurt her. He knew that she couldn't have any more kids. She had a permanent procedure done so that she wouldn't have any more children. And he wanted to do this to her so that she would be scarred forever. And honestly, I'm truly amazed by Faith in this moment. I don't think any of us here can imagine what she must have felt like in that moment. And if you have lost a child and it has been in a violent manner, I am so sorry to you. To lose all of your children in such a horrific way at the hands of someone that you once loved and thought loved you and loved these children, it's horrific. And then to have to battle through not only deep emotional wounds, but physical ones as well. Faith was and continues to be unbelievably strong. What she endured was more than any one person should have to ever go through in a lifetime, let alone in one single day. When Faith finally recovered and grieved privately with her family, the entire community reacted with shock and horror to the gruesome news. The Dearborn Heights Mayor Dan Paletko even said that it was just difficult to understand the motivation, that he just doesn't understand what happened in this household, and he couldn't fathom this whole process. He also mentioned that the family's home was well kept, they had no ordinance violations, and everyone who lived there had no known conflicts with their neighbors. So from the outside, the Greens had appeared in every sense to be a normal, happy family. Even the Greens' neighbors confirmed this. One neighbor, Terry Strickland, said they were just quiet and the kids seemed happy and the dad seemed really good too. Terry even explained that one time, Greg had actually hit his car, but he was polite. He came over and knocked on the door, told him what happened, and they worked things out. He seemed like a really good guy. But that's the thing. A lot of times these men are charmers. They do seem like really good guys. That's why they're able to work their way into people's lives. Another neighbor, Jim Goldie, he was a longtime resident in the area. He said that this was the worst thing that had ever happened there. And police affirmed Jim's sense that things like this just didn't happen in Dearborn Heights. The community usually only saw about 7 homicides in 1 year. To experience 4 in one night was unheard of. One member of the community was even more shocked than anyone else, Chadney Allen Sr., the father of Kiara and Chadney. He expressed his shock and his grief at the sudden loss of his 2 children. He said that he hadn't seen any red flags in Greg and Faith's relationship, and the community did everything they could to try to unite behind Faith and the children's other relatives in this difficult time. Faith's coworkers even created a GoFundMe to make sure that she had enough money to get by while she took time off of work. And neighbors put up a memorial outside the family's 1-story home, bringing candles, stuffed animals, and balloons in loving memory of Chadney, Kiara, Coy, and Kaylee. Back at the hospital, Faith was confronted with more difficult news. While she was still recovering, she learned the whole truth about Greg's past and his marriage to Tanya. A truth that, had she known it, could have prevented her from ever forming any relationship with this monster. Greg's 1992 killing of Tanya, Faith learned, had not been an unfortunate accident. He had murdered Tanya in cold blood. And the details of this killing were so eerily similar to what he had just done to Faith and her children. At the time of her death, Tanya was 6 months pregnant with Greg's child. Tanya, just like Faith, had 2 children from another relationship. Luckily, Tanya's children were hiding while Greg attacked their mother, and for some reason at the time, he spared their lives, but not Tanya's. Greg stabbed her repeatedly in the face and in the chest, killing both her and their unborn child. Then he placed the butcher knife that he used into the refrigerator and called the police, reporting himself, just like he did on the morning of September 21st, when he killed his second entire family. When police arrived, Greg calmly led them to the refrigerator, showed them the murder weapon, and then he went into the police station and gave a full confession. Greg and Tanya's neighbors said that the couple fought a lot. One neighbor said that she never heard anyone argue like those two. There was just so much rage. But despite Greg's evident tendency towards violence, his family came to his defense during his trial. Greg pleaded no contest to second-degree murder, and his mother, Tommy Lee Green, said that she didn't believe Gregory was a threat to society, that she didn't believe a long sentence would make him any better because he already suffered enough, and he would continue to suffer for the rest of his life. I don't know how I feel about that. Well, actually, I kind of do know how I feel. How do you feel? Because a lot of times families, they still love perpetrators. They still try to see them in a good light. But a lot of times, they are truly monsters. In this case, that was entirely true. Tanya's family and friends were devastated when these pleas worked, and Greg only received 15 to 20 years for his brutal killing of Tanya. In prison, as soon as he could, Greg applied for parole, and he was determined to get out even earlier than 15 years. But of course, he was denied. A report from 2004 stated that Greg showed no remorse and openly blamed Tanya for her own death. Another report said that he had not gained adequate insight and that he lacked empathy. All in, Greg's parole was denied 4 separate times, with each report citing his cold lack of empathy and remorse. However, suddenly in 2008, after serving 16 years, Greg was paroled, and the parole board explained this change of heart by saying that Greg had a great prison record, good work logs, had completed several educational courses, which helped him see the error of his ways. Plus, according to them, he had a strong support system outside of prison who were prepared to help him transition successfully back into civilian life. They cited letters from his parents and his sister, which stated that they believed that Greg was very sorry for what he did, and he gained insight into his behaviors, and he worked hard in prison and continued to make positive adjustments. And over the years, he had become closer to the Lord, and he read his Bible every day. In explaining their decision to parole Greg, parole board officials said that the parole board works hard to review the facts and the information that they have at the time to determine whether they have a reasonable assurance that a prisoner won't reoffend. They explained that it can be very difficult to predict a person's future behavior, especially through a person's lifetime. But excuse me, I personally think that's a load of bullshit. He stabbed his pregnant wife to death. Anyone could predict that he would almost certainly reoffend. Come on. That's reasonable. But this comes back to the larger point I wanted to make in this episode, that offenders like this are not always treated with the same seriousness and severity that they should be. That Greg only received a maximum of 20 years in prison for murder is absurd. And then he got out 4 years early because he finally expressed just a little bit of remorse after blaming his victim for most of the time that he spent there. That's even more absurd. Everything that happened to Faith and her children, in my mind, was preventable. If only the courts, the prison system, and the parole board had done a better job assessing the very real risk that Greg posed, especially to those he was in an intimate relationship with. His horrible history, what he did to his other family and pregnant wife, only makes it look worse that the courts would not allow Faith to get a restraining order. All it would have taken was one simple look in Greg's file to see that he was exactly the type of person a woman might need a protective order against. But no one checked. Greg failed Faith, that's for sure. But the systems that are supposed to protect our citizens also failed Faith at every juncture. But she said it from the beginning. If it had been really bad, they wouldn't have let him out. If only that were true. On top of all of this shocking new information, Faith also had to grapple with her father's role in Greg's release. When I spoke about Greg receiving parole, I mentioned that one of the reasons he was released early was because of the strong community support that the parole board thought Greg would get upon release. I also mentioned earlier that Faith met Greg through her father. He worked with parolees in his role as a church minister. However, Faith's father didn't just work with Greg after his release. He was instrumental in helping secure Greg's early release, writing a long letter to the parole board on his behalf. That letter reads as follows. I greet you in the name of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. I'm writing this letter in support of Gregory Green. I understand that he is being considered for parole. Gregory was attending our church before he was sentenced to prison. He was very faithful attendance-wise, shows a great interest in the Lord, and was very helpful. Over the years, we and some of the members have communicated with Gregory. I through visits, as well as letters occasionally, and others through mail. Our ministry deals with correcting behavioral problems by understanding their origin, how we've been affected by them, and what we must do to change them. This procedure is called inner healing and deliverance. With this technique in mind, while interacting with Gregory, I've noticed a great deal of growth, and his understanding has matured quite a bit, as well as his processing skills. If he was to be released, he would be welcomed as part of our church community, and whatever we could do to help him adjust, we would. While I personally can try to understand Faith's father's actions, that they may have been compassionate, his compassion was unfortunately misplaced. After Greg was arrested for the second time, this time for the murder of Faith's 4 children, Faith's father swore they had no idea the extent of Greg's previous misdeeds. He said that he, like Faith, had thought it was a situation of self-defense, but Faith still feels that he should have told her more than what he did. She feels that if her father would have spoken with her, she might have never even married Greg. And I'm not sure what to think about this entire situation. I tend to agree with Faith. I guess I just don't fully buy that her father didn't know what Greg had done. How could he be communicating with Greg in prison, writing to a parole board, and work with Greg as a minister and not know exactly what he had done? And how could he not step in when his own daughter started dating someone he knew had murdered his previous partner, whether or not it was self-defense? Faith's feelings on the issue were complicated. She said she didn't even know how to feel about her dad. She didn't want to bash him or anything, but at that point in her life, she didn't even want to deal with him. Learning about Greg's past crimes, uncovering her father's involvement in Greg's early release, Faith still had to bury her 4 children. Her family posted a GoFundMe to attempt to raise money for the 4 funerals. The page read, "Words cannot describe the horrific tragedy our family is experiencing over the untimely deaths of Chadney, Kiera, Coy, and Kaylee. There's no way a mother could fathom laying to rest 1 child, let alone all 4 children, at once without life insurance." End quote. Prior to the funeral, in an effort to alleviate any questions at the event itself, Faith tried to hold a press conference, but when the day came, she couldn't bear to face the media. Instead, a representative told the press that Faith was having a very hard day, and that the main message she wanted to convey to the reporters was not to forget her children. So many people were focused on Gregory Green and all the horrible things that he had done that they were forgetting about what really mattered: Chadney, Kiera, Coy, and Kaylee. A joint service for the 4 children was held at the Detroit First Church of the Nazarene and lasted over 2 hours with over 1,000 attendees. Family members had to help Faith into her seat in the front row as she was still suffering from her own injuries. A letter Faith wrote to her children was read. It said, quote, "I know your love. My dear babies, I love you all." The 4 children were buried at St. Hedwig Cemetery in Dearborn Heights. Chadney's headstone read, "Love you always, son." Kiera's headstone said, "Love you always, baby girl." Coy's read, "Mom loves her princess," and Kaylee said, "Mommy loves her sweet pea." Now it was time for Greg Green to pay for what he had done, to be investigated, tried, and punished for being the reason that those 4 headstones even existed. The investigation into the brutal quadruple murder was short. Police had an eyewitness, a confession, and a murder weapon, but they still needed to gather evidence to make sure the case was airtight. When they processed the crime scene, the house was still hung with decorations from Coy's recent birthday party. Looking into Greg's credit card statements, they also found proof that he had purchased the piping he used to asphyxiate Coy and Kaylee from Home Depot a few days earlier. This receipt was a key piece of evidence because it proved that Greg had planned the killings in advance rather than acted in the heat of passion in the moment. After the investigation was wrapped up, trial proceedings began. But just days before the court date, Faith was mercifully granted a divorce from Greg so that she could enter the courtroom not as his wife, but as Faith, the loving mother of 4 children, determined to see justice brought against the man who had murdered them. The first hearing lasted only 2 minutes. Faith appeared in a wheelchair, wearing a black veil that covered her face. Greg appeared in his prison uniform and was silent throughout the entire proceedings. At this hearing, the state explained that Greg would be evaluated by the Center for Forensic Psychiatry regarding his criminal responsibility and competence to stand trial. Soon after, thankfully, Greg was ruled sane and competent by a psychiatrist. This was good news. This eliminated the possibility of Greg attempting to say he was insane and using an insanity defense. Assistant Wayne County Prosecutor Tricia Gerard said that he knew what he was going to do. He planned it. And she emphasized that Greg's actions were not that of an insane person acting out in a moment of mania, but rather the premeditated, cold, calculated actions of a family annihilator. Greg was charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of torture, 1 count of assault with the intent to do great bodily harm less than murder, and 1 felony firearm charge. To everyone's surprise, Greg was offered a plea deal, which he gladly accepted. The judge explained the rationale behind the plea deal. She said that given what Greg had done, she was hesitant to accept the plea deal in this case, but given that this deal guaranteed Greg would remain in prison until he was 97 years old, that would save Faith the trauma of a long, drawn-out trial and an appeals process, so the judge felt it was appropriate in this case. Faith gave her approval for the plea deal. Per the plea, the assault and torture charges were dismissed, and the murders were all downgraded to 2nd degree in exchange for Greg remaining in prison with no chance of parole until he was 97 years old. Greg's attorney said that Greg took the plea deal because he was remorseful, and he just wanted to get it over with. At sentencing, Greg explained his actions and apologized, saying it was in God's hands, that only God can judge him, and he's sorry that this happened, and that God knows his heart and knows how regretful and sorry he really was. But I'm sorry, you've done this twice. Twice. It's unbelievable. And he feels bad? Seriously? That's all he could mutter, that he feels bad.
I just want to say, well, first of all, thank God, saying, only he can judge. I do regret and I'm sorry for what has happened. All I've ever wanted was a God-fearing helpmate that would support me and be faithful no matter what. It was dedicated to the whole family. That put aside, I have to be humble, very humble, because God knows the heart. He knows how regretful, how sorry I am. And even now, after all this, He still has a plan. And I'm not giving that up, giving up on that plan. Because God is God. And there's not one day that go by that I don't think of my girls. I pray that God be with Chadney and Carol. I feel bad for how this has deeply impacted everyone. And may God help them, help me, help us all.
I don't even know how Faith just sat there and listened to this man cry over a tragedy that he caused. And Faith made a victim impact statement. Greg cried as she made that statement. She spoke about her children's aspirations and dreams and how because of Greg, they would never be able to achieve them. She talked about how she missed her children so much and that words would never be able to explain it. But here's what she said.
I'm not happy. I'm not satisfied with the outcome. There's no punishment that fits the crime. Not even torture and death would be justice. Your justice will come when you burn in hell for all eternity for murdering 4 innocent children, all because you're insecure as a man. Plus the other 2 lives you took. You are a con artist, you are a monster, you are a devil in disguise. You are now forever exposed. I've thought over and over again what I would say, even though it doesn't even matter. First of all, I am not and did not and will not suffer like you intended for me to do. What you tried to do didn't work. I am and was a damn great mother to all of my children. I was their mother and father. I'm the one who took out the time with each and every one of them. I taught them how to do things as well as people in my family and friends.
She explained how she now suffers from PTSD, and some days she wished she had died too. Doctors explain the short-term memory loss by saying that her brain is protecting her from the memories of her children being killed in front of her face. People in the court could see the scar in her face that stretched from her ear to her chin. And she said sometimes she dreams about the night that it happened, and she wakes up screaming and sweating and thinking that somehow she can save her children, and then she realizes that it's a nightmare, but it's also her reality, and that her children are gone. Sentencing ended with Judge Dana Hathaway reading Greg's sentence. She described Greg's actions as inconceivable and beyond understanding, and I have to agree. She went on to say that fathers are supposed to protect their children. Husbands are supposed to protect their wives. Greg is currently 57 years old. He's incarcerated in a correctional facility where he will remain until he's 97 years old. His earliest possible release date is in almost 40 years from now in September of 2063. And as the judge said, Greg will likely spend the rest of his life in prison, paying for these unfathomable crimes, as he should. Unfortunately, Faith also has to live with this crime for the rest of her life. What Greg did will never leave her. But in the years following her unimaginable loss, Faith has focused on healing and education. She said that even though you don't ever really get past it, you learn how to cope, and some days are better than others. She's tried to do something special to honor each of her children. For Chadney, she created Chadwear, a line of clothing that honors his artwork. For Kiera, she has accepted her diploma from Southfield High School. And for Coy and Kaylee, her daughters who love to dress up, she created a line of lip glosses. And over time, she said that things have gotten better. Another major way in which she honors her children's legacy is by working tirelessly to prevent violence like this. In all of her work, her focus is on helping women understand and notice the warning signs. She wrote a book about her own experience entitled The Monster Who Killed His Family Twice for this exact reason. This book tells her own story, but it also has many resources for other women who may be struggling with the same type of violence. It outlines all the warning signs that Faith wishes she had known about. She also speaks at various survivors events, and she attends one event called Painting My Pain, where survivors create artwork to represent their experience, and the proceeds from the sales of their artwork help to fund TV resources for the community. Here is one of her speeches at one of the events.
It's hard to go on when you see people with their kids, and then like, you know, if you have to go to the store, it's like you try to hurry up and pass the clothes, because then it's like, oh, I would have bought that for them. And then it's like, even though people may say like, oh, she's smiling, she looks okay, but you know, really, I'm not. I have a lot of bad days. My depression has gotten worse. Like I used to didn't believe those commercials where they say depression hurts. It really hurts. There's days I cannot get up. I have to kind of pep talk myself. It's, you know, just it's a hard day. It's hard. This year is worse than last year. I did write something to tell everybody. I'm sorry.
Take your time. Take your time.
I just wanted to take this time out to say thank you to everyone that donated in any way to help my family and I during the tragedy we gone through. So many people wrote letters, sent flowers, visited me, and prepared food. It's overwhelming, and I didn't want people to think like I forgot about them, or, you know, because they reached out to me and helped me.
As she tries to heal, her focus is also on helping others. She's holding a memorial this Sunday in honor of her children. It's a celebration where she's also raising money for scholarships.
This event ended up raising enough money to secure a home for a person transitioning out of a dangerous situation. In the spirit of Faith's book and advocacy work, I'm going to take a moment to share a few of the most common signs to look for. One is extreme jealousy, which may manifest in accusations of flirting, jealousy over time spent with others, dropping by unexpectedly, or questioning you about who you speak with or who you spend your time with. Another warning sign is controlling behavior. This may involve checking up on you, or checking your car's odometer, timing your outings, how long it takes you to get back from somewhere you said you were going through your phone, your email, or your internet history, maybe even controlling your finances or even how you dress. The next one is a big one. I think we've all been trained to think that falling in love quickly or at first sight is romantic, but it's also a tactic. Love bombing, or coming on very strong at the beginning of a relationship, is one way that these people lure their victims in, making them feel so loved that when more problematic behaviors emerge, they keep hoping that things will go back to the picture-perfect beginning. They often don't take accountability for their own actions and are hypersensitive to criticism. They may blame everyone else for their behaviors, and they may make you think that shifting the blame towards them is a personal attack. They will often isolate their victims from networks of support. They will put down your friends, your family, and encourage you to distance yourself from them. They may also have unrealistic expectations for perfection in their partners and respond cruelly with verbal abuse when you fail to meet their impossible standards and demands. They often curse, name call, put their victims down, put down their accomplishments, and they're also prone to mood swings. And then, of course, there are obvious ones like threats of violence made toward you or maybe in their past with another partner. And the one thing I want to add about this is that this kind of behavior is not situational. They will often say that, oh, they hit their partner in the past because this, that, or the other thing. There were things going on in their life. Their relationship was bad. No, it's never situational. It's about power. And all the research says if someone has hit their partner before, they're almost certainly going to do it again. So if you or someone you know are experiencing any or all of these risk factors, help is available. You can text, call, or chat with experts at thehotline.org. This is an epidemic. It causes more than 1,500 deaths each year and about 4 a day. Black women like Faith are at even more of a risk, experiencing intimate partner violence and homicide at a risk of 4.4 per 100,000. That's twice the national average. It's important to know the signs because the people that do this to others, they get to know them. They know how to control them, how to deceive them. This is what Greg did to Faith. He knew her inside and out. She loved him, and he used that to manipulate her for years. And finally, doing the cruelest thing imaginable to her and her 4 beautiful children. Nothing can ever repair the hole that Greg left in Faith's life when he took her children away from her. Thank you so much for being here today for Faith's story. When we think about the evil acts people are capable of, There are two major categories: impulsive crimes done in a fit of rage and premeditated crimes that are planned and calculated. And with either one, when someone does something so horrible, you have to wonder if they have any human emotions at all. This case was both impulsive and premeditated, fueled by rage, calculated, and cold-blooded. It will have you questioning, how far can evil spread, corrupting the minds of the people around you? Can you trust your friends or your family? And how well do you know the people you love the most? Dedra Lynn Mims was born on July 23rd of 1967 to her parents, her father Kendall Wayne Mims, who went by Booney, and her mother Elizabeth Mims, who everyone called Faye. And soon you will find out that unique names ran in their family. Dedra had an older sister, Kendra, and a younger sister, Tedra. I told you, I definitely had never heard the name Tedra in my life. Any unique names that you've heard of, let me know, share them in the comments. We've already decided on a name for our daughter, but we still need a middle name. And thank you, by the way, for all of your patience. Totally unpredictable when she will make an appearance into this world. But I am in my last couple weeks now. Dedra and her sisters were born and raised in Clanton, Alabama. It's a town in Chilton County and has a population of only 6,000 people at the time. Clanton is halfway between the cities of Montgomery and Birmingham, which actually have the two largest populations in all of Alabama. So it's a great central location for people in business and manufacturing. Dedra's dad, Booney, was a salesman, and I have to wonder if his nickname came from his love of the small town South. Clanton was a small town with a lot of character. It's known for its peach harvest every year, and even the water tower is painted to look like a giant peach. Let me know if you have any cool landmarks where you live, because I love reading those in the comments. Dedra grew up in Thornsby School District, a 10-minute drive away, and that is where she met her first love, Tommy Lee Hunt. And when it came to relationships, Tommy and Dedra were serious from the beginning. They were very family oriented, and they came from big families themselves, so they wanted a family of their own right away. And Dedra always knew she wanted to be a mom. So right after graduation, Tommy proposed, and the couple got married and moved into a house at 106 Church Street in Thornsby, which was right across the street from a church and a playground. Before they knew it, Dedra was pregnant with a baby girl, and at the age of 21, she gave birth to her first little bundle of joy on April 9th, 1989, a little girl they named Chelsea Marie Hunt. And being a mom is a full-time job, and Dedra prided herself in her job. She was a great mom. She was patient, empathetic, bold, and a lot of fun. She was the perfect person to have in your corner. And even though Dedra took a while to open up to people in her life, once she placed her trust in you, you knew what was on her mind. She was very blunt and straightforward. She had a strong moral compass, a quirky 80s fashion sense, and a huge heart. A year and a half after Chelsea was born, Dedra gave birth to another little girl, and it was now her turn to come up with a unique name for daughter number 2, and she chose the name Chalisa. Chalisa Nicole Hunt was born on December 12th of 1990, and she inherited her mama's curly hair and her daddy's big blue eyes, and so did her sister Chelsea. Dedra loved to dress the girls up in matching outfits. They looked like twins. They had those cute little button noses and the huge almond-shaped eyes, except for the color of their hair. Chalisa's was very blonde, and Chelsea's was already getting a little darker by that time, but they still looked a lot alike. However, in terms of their personalities, they couldn't be more different. Chelsea was not much of a girly girl. She was outdoorsy. She liked to play and get her hands dirty and play a little rough, but she always had a big smile on her face, and she was a natural protector, especially of her little sister. She was sporty, and she even played on a little league softball team that was coached by Dedra's sister, Kendra. Dedra and her two sisters were always close growing up, and they remained close as they became adults. Little Chelsea was also a natural comedian. One time her auntie Tara, which is her dad Tommy's sister, gave her a bag of cashews to try for the first time. And Chelsea ate every single one in the bag before she said she hated them. And that sounds exactly like something I would do as a kid. Now, as for little Chalisa, she loved laughing and joking with Chelsea, but she was the girly girl. She was polite, dainty. She loved princesses and dolls and dressing up in bows and dresses. Chalisa always wanted her hair to be perfect as well. They once went to a pet store and a bird was placed on her shoulder, And Chalisa was afraid that the bird would mess up her curls. That's adorable. When asked what she wanted to be when she grew up, Chalisa always responded the same way. She said she wanted to be a mommy. That is so cute. And so were these children. They actually remind me of Mary Kate and Ashley Olsen with those almond-shaped big blue eyes. And every year, the girls would dress up for Halloween, and they would celebrate the holidays with their family. And in the springtime, Chelsea and Chalisa helped their Aunt Tara plant flowers in the backyard. And when these flowers bloomed, the girls would pick them on Mother's Day, take them to church, and gift them to all the moms, of course, including their own. How sweet is that? One time they planted and picked 40 flowers, and they gathered them up and they wrapped them up so beautifully to be given away. Chelsea and Chalisa were animal lovers as well. Tommy and Dedra adopted a new puppy, and the girls were so excited. But then they were devastated when their little puppy got out and ran away. And the girls comforted one another and they took care of one another. But like typical siblings, they also got in their little arguments. Every disagreement was the end of the world for two little girls, but by the end of the day, one of them would always apologize and they would go back to giggling and sharing secrets. In 1994, when Chelsea was 5 and Chalisa was around 3.5 years old at the time, Tommy and Dedra separated. They had grown apart, which can happen when you do marry young. There are just so many changes that happen from high school to adulthood. Dedra and Tommy agreed that Tommy would actually stay in Thornsby and have custody of Chelsea and Chalisa. Dedra was heartbroken, but she definitely tried to hide it from her daughters. She didn't want the relationship to change. However, it was a sacrifice she made for them so that they could stay in the same school district they were in. The parents believed that this stability was very important. And Tommy recognized that Dedra was sacrificing her time with her daughters for their happiness, and he had the utmost respect for her. He felt that Dedra would always be a part of his life. Even Tommy's sister Tara said a piece of paper couldn't change the fact that Dedra was family. Dedra kept Tommy's last name, and their efforts to reconcile their differences actually paid off. Even if they weren't romantic anymore, they vowed to co-parent as civilly as they could, and Chelsea and Chalisa never felt awkward or upset about having divorced parents, and they spent 2 weekends a month with their mom. Now, initially, of course, this transition into being a single parent presented challenges for both parents. Tommy quickly tried to embrace his new role. He learned to cook and clean and even mastered styling the girls' hair in ponytails. Dedra got back into dating, and eventually she met a handsome older man named Randy. She called her sister Kendra, and she let her know that her new man was a sweetheart. He was attentive to all of her needs, and he even offered to let Dedra move into his home. And soon she was introducing him to her daughters, and she was struck by how patient and playful and great he was with the little girls. Let me tell you a little more about Randy Gerald Duke. He was born on January 15th of 1958 in Chicago, Illinois, and he was about 9 years older than Dedra. And I couldn't help but notice his parents' names seemed like they were straight out of a fairy tale. His father was Woodrow Earl Duke, and his mother was Othello Victoria Durham Duke. Othello was from Chilton County, and Randy spent his childhood in Alabama along with his siblings Daniel, Denny, Billy, Ned, and Joyce. He attended Jemison High School, where he had that popular shaggy long hairstyle. And after graduation, he actually became a plumber. In his early 20s, Randy got married to a woman named Tara Eccles, and the couple had a son that they named Mark Anthony Duke in 1980. Unfortunately, Randy and Tara's relationship was short-lived, and Randy was not ready for the commitment of fatherhood at the time. So Tara remained in custody of Mark, who actually used to go by Anthony Eccles when he was younger. By the time Anthony was 10, Tara was struggling to make ends meet. She lived in a rundown rural home. It didn't have a toilet or running water, and she wasn't able to provide for Anthony. So Randy and Anthony actually reconnected when he was 10, and when Anthony was 14, Randy was given custody of his son, and Anthony moved in with him. But by this time, Randy was in his mid-30s. He had a mortgage on a house in Pelham, and he lived at 2327 Chandelwood Drive. And this is in the Chandelar subdivision, an upper middle-class neighborhood, and the home was really nice. It was a 2-story, 3-bedroom, 2-bath home with a nice big backyard, a fireplace in the living room, a really great sized kitchen, and it was the perfect home for a family. Pelham was a blue-collar city in Shelby County. It's about a 30-minute drive from Thornsby and close enough to Birmingham to feel like a suburb. It's also the perfect spot for nature lovers. There's the Alabama Wildlife Center and a diving pool called the Blue Water Park. Randy was working 2 jobs at the time when he moved in. He was a plumber for Mr. Reuter Plumbing Services, and he was also an employee of the Alabama Alcoholic Beverage Control Commission, which I will get into later. But Randy was known by his neighbors to be very generous, but private. He told his neighbor, Angie, that if she needed any help with her plumbing to call him anytime. But then he had another neighbor, and that person couldn't even tell you what Randy's last name was. So that's a testament to how busy Randy was with his jobs, his son, and his relationships. Back then, Randy was engaged to a woman named Donna Cola Francesco, and she was a school teacher who cared deeply about Randy's son. Now, Anthony had changed back to his first name, Mark, not to get confusing, but Donna tried to step in and mother Mark to be there for him since he was without his birth mom. And of course, Randy was busy with work, so Donna took him under her wing. While Randy worked, Donna drove Mark to and from football practice. At his high school, she took him shopping, and she let him hang out with all of his friends. So you can imagine that when Donna and Randy's 4-year relationship ended, it affected Mark deeply. It's like he was losing another mother. It was a very hard situation. But Randy knew that he had to make time to step up for his son, and that's exactly what he did. He was the best single dad he could be. And when Dedra, Chelsea, and Chalisa came into Mark and Randy's life, he saw it as a godsend. Randy could not wait to have a built-in family, plus more stability for his son, Mark. Randy called up his brother Daniel and said that Dedra was the one. Mark loved looking after Chelsea and Chalisa, and they had a really good thing going. Of course, the girls' parental aunt Tara was intrigued when she heard all about how much the girls liked Randy. So she made it a point to meet him in person herself, and Tara quickly discovered that the girls' first impressions of him were accurate. Randy was sweet, he was a caring man who genuinely loved the little girls and Dedra. Tara observed how Randy treated Dedra with respect, and that further strengthened her trust in his character. And by 1997, Dedra had moved in with Randy. Then, just a year afterward, Randy proposed, and Dedra said yes. So their 5-person family was coming together. Randy set a wedding date, and Dedra started the venue search. So let me bring you up to the present date in this case. It was 1997, as I said, and at this time, Randy was 39, Dedra was 29, Mark was 16 and in high school, Chelsea was 7 going on 8 and enrolled in 2nd grade at Thornsby, and she was actually on the AB honor roll. Chalisa had just turned 6 years old and was loving kindergarten. Mark was like a big brother to his future stepsisters. One of his high school classmates said that he could tell how much he cared about them and that Mark would even give his life for Chelsea and Chalisa. He protected them. And over winter break that year, Dedra went with the Hunt family on a beach vacation. Tommy and his sister Tara were sharing a hotel room with Chelsea and Chalisa, and for breakfast, the girls were allowed to have brownies, they could jump on the bed, and they could stay up late and watch movies. It was one of those magical vacations where you cherish every moment. But they had no idea at the time that it would be their last. On Friday, March 21st of 1997, little Chalisa participated in her very first beauty pageant. It was the weekend before Easter, so the little girls were dressed in spring colors, and they paraded around the stage at Thornsby School. And Chalisa wore a white ruffled dress, white socks, and white shoes, and a little white bow, and she looked like an angel. Her hair was half up and half down, curled in tight little ringlets, and she had the biggest grin on her face. Tara, Tommy, and Dedra were there to cheer her on. And Chalisa was actually voted second alternate, which means that she was in the 3rd place spot for her age group. And that's amazing for her very first show. And afterward, she told the family she wanted to do more pageants. That night, they went back to Tommy's, where Dedra helped Chalisa change out of her dress and into some pajamas. And then she packed up the girls' bags for the weekend stay at Randy's with her. While Chelsea waited, they played the game Trouble with Tommy and Tara, and Chelsea won, and she celebrated for the rest of the night. I remember that game. I used to love that game. I love the way the little popper sounded. If you know, you know. Once they were ready to go, The girls hugged and kissed their daddy goodbye, and Dedra promised to drop them back off with him on Sunday night, as per their usual co-parenting routine. Everything seemed so ordinary. It would be just another fun weekend together at Randy's in Pelham. Except it wasn't. Around 8:40 p.m. on Sunday, March 23rd, 1997, the night Dedra was set to return the girls to Tommy's house, a call came in to the Pelham County 911 dispatch center. It was a male's voice on the other end, reporting that his family had been killed. He was yelling, "They killed my family." The dispatcher quickly sent a team of first responders to Chandelwood Drive, and when they arrived, they found a distraught teenager standing outside in the dark. It was Mark Duke. He was the one that called in. When first responders realized that it was Mark's family that could be heard inside, they knew Mark could be in danger. A killer had made their way into this home. So what if they were in there waiting for Mark to return? Mark went with an officer to a juvenile center where he was entered into protective custody until this investigation could be conducted, and they knew that Mark would be out of harm's way. Not to mention, they needed to know what Mark had seen. And of course, this was a very heartbreaking and traumatic experience for everyone or anyone. So they wanted to make sure they got Mark the help that he would need. Now, back to the scene. The police that arrived were aware right away that this was a homicide. It was a very bloody crime scene, and they immediately cordoned off the perimeter with crime scene tape, and they radioed for further assistance. So Detective Sergeant Mark Hall, Chief District Attorney Randy Hillman, and Captain of the Police Department Tommy Thomas, yes, that was his name, were sent out. And I know it can get a little confusing when there's multiple Randys and Tommys. It was the 90s. Those were very common names at the time, but I will be using their last names, so don't worry. When these three men arrived, they were told by police officers it was bad, that it was really brutal inside. But let's start with the outside of Randy Duke's home. There were 4 vehicles parked outside, 2 sporty pickup trucks, a car that belonged to Dedra, and Randy's plumbing truck. The house itself was actually 3 levels because in addition to the ground floor and the upstairs, it also had a basement. Detective Hall was the first inside. He walked in and could tell right away the house was in disarray. There were miscellaneous items all over the floor of the living room. We see this a lot in violent crimes when, of course, there is a struggle. But there are circumstances when a perpetrator will stage the scene to make it look like a robbery, and they'll throw things everywhere because they want it to look like they were searching for valuables. So it's never a good idea to jump to conclusions because anything is possible. On the living room floor was an adult male. He was face down, leaning over the brick of the fireplace, and there was a pool of blood around him. It was obvious he sustained multiple wounds. It appeared that he'd been shot and stabbed, mostly in the head and back. And next to him was just the blade of a knife. The handle was missing. The blade was serrated, and it looked like the type of steak knife that would be found in a kitchen. And it was used with such force that the handle broke off. Wow. Captain Thomas thought that it was such a violent scene that whoever did this must have hated this man. It was clear this was overkill and most likely personal in nature because they say that like 99 times out of 100, knife murders require a level of rage and familiarity that you don't associate with strangers. But I have to wonder about that statistic because I recently covered a case of Karen Slattery, and she was targeted by a stranger with a knife. So you never know. But since knife deaths are so up close, it's one of the first theories. Now I want to point out that when I was listening to these men explain what they saw in that house that night, none of them were able to hold back tears, especially Hall and Hillman, who led this investigation. Hillman will never forget what he saw when he looked behind the man. There was a coffee table, which was set up so that Randy and his family could watch TV from the couch. It's also a place where Chelsea and Chalisa would frequently do little art projects. And on the coffee table were 2 half-finished crayon drawings. And those drawings were covered in droplets of blood. Hillman couldn't help but tear up. He'd never seen anything like this before. It was an emotional scene. The juxtaposition between imagining a happy child coloring and then those dark red blood stains scattered on top of the page. He didn't want to think about what happened and what they might find further into this home, because right there on the sofa was more blood. And worse, there were human teeth. There were whole teeth and broken teeth scattered on the couch. And there was a trail of blood leading from this area into the hallway where this staircase was. And that blood didn't look like it came from the deceased man. So that meant someone else was hurt. And they wondered, could it be the killer or more victims? Hall and Hillman were horrified, knowing that they still had to go through the rest of this house. And they were terrified of what they may find. As the investigators made their way upstairs, they found 3 bedrooms. 2 of the bedrooms faced the front of the house, and the blood trail led down the hall and into the primary bedroom at the back of the house. This bedroom was also in disarray. The dresser drawers were open, there was clothes scattered all over the floor, and the door to the attached primary bathroom was shut. The door itself was a 6-panel door with thick wood, but there was a hole punched through it on one of the upper panels, and beneath the door, leaking into the bedroom, was even more blood. Actually, this would turn out to be the most bloody crime scene they had ever been to. We're going to get to that in a moment. Hillman tried to open this door to the bathroom, but it was either stuck or locked, but there was a hole that was punched or kicked near the doorknob. So they figured the person who made that hole was attempting to reach their arm inside and unlock this door. Hillman peeked through the hole, and the scene inside was as brutal as it was downstairs. It was worse, actually. They couldn't open the door because against the door, he could make out the body of a deceased woman. It looked like she must have been trying to barricade the door shut. And once they were able to pry this door open, it revealed an unfathomable reality. On the far end of this bathroom, in the shower, was a little girl with blonde curls. It was clear she was no longer alive, and they could tell that she had a slash on her throat, which is just unbelievable to even imagine. This was the hardest job that Officer Hall and Hillman had to do. They had to move forward. They had to check every one of the rooms of this house. So they backtracked and they checked a bedroom that looked like it belonged to a teenage boy. It was also completely ransacked, and they noticed that carved into the sheetrock walls were symbols that looked like gang signs. There were pentagrams and even acronyms like the word Folks, Folks. Officers didn't know what this meant. Was this some kind of satanic sacrifice? Was it gang violence coming out of Birmingham? They weren't sure, but they had one more room to check. In the last bedroom was the final act. Lying on the floor over an air conditioning vent was a young girl with longer hair and darker curls lying face down. There was blood all over this room, on the walls, on the floors, and underneath the body. From the way that she was lying, Captain Thomas said it looked like she had been dragged out from underneath the bed and killed in the process. She had multiple lacerations on her body, and next to the girl was a blood-soaked bandana, which was collected as evidence. Like the other little girl, they could tell she had a wound to her throat, and the detectives could not hold back their tears. On her tiny hands were defensive wounds. She put up a fight in her last painful and terrifying moments. Captain Thomas had never seen a child in this condition before, and he was having a really hard time dealing with it, as I can only imagine. Detective Hall couldn't understand the type of monster that could do this to 2 innocent little precious children, but he knew that he had to keep his composure because it was up to him to find out. Less than 30 minutes into this investigation, a vehicle pulls into the driveway, and a guy comes running up to the front door of the house. Now, at this point in the investigation, the investigators were not sure who the people that were found dead inside this house were. They knew that Mark Duke had made the 911 call and that he identified his father, Randy, as the person deceased inside. So they figured that that was the adult male they found downstairs. But they didn't know much about who we know as Dedra, Chelsea, and Chalisa. And we know that those are the other people found in the home because of their descriptions. The officers wondered who this man walking up to the house was and what he was doing there. When he made eye contact with them, he had this look in his eyes like he knew exactly what happened inside. He introduced himself as Tommy Hunt, and he said he was the father of the 2 girls that were staying there. At that moment, Hillman knew that he had to relay this horrific news to this man. He told him that everyone inside that home was deceased, including 2 young female children. Tommy broke down. He was wailing, and it was such an intense display of emotion and grief that Hillman couldn't tell if Tommy was genuinely upset or if he was pretending that he was. Because what were the odds that Tommy would show up at his ex-wife's house before the officers had notified anyone that these killings had occurred? Who notified him? How would Tommy know to come there? Well, Tommy explained he was the one that had custody of his 2 daughters, and Dedra was supposed to drop Chelsea and Chalisa off hours ago. She never showed up, so he called, and Dedra didn't answer or call him back, and it was getting late. And when it finally got to 9:30 p.m. past the girls' bedtime, he decided to just drive over himself and pick them up. That's when, of course, he saw the commotion, the crime scene tape, the police vehicles, and he knew something bad must have happened. Tommy was taken back to the station and interrogated. After all, this was Dedra's ex-husband. They always have to look into the people close to the victim. But would this man kill his own children? He seemed completely distraught. And if Tommy wasn't responsible, maybe he knew about Randy and Dedra's relationship with each other and other people and friends, and maybe he could provide authorities with valuable leads. Tommy said the last time that he saw Dedra and the girls was on Friday night after Chalisa's pageant. He admitted, of course, his divorce from Dedra was hard. They were high school sweethearts, and falling out of love with anyone leads to high-strung emotions. But now he said that he and Dedra were really good friends and they co-parented well. He said Dedra was a great mom, and he didn't know anyone who would want to harm her or the children. But Tommy didn't know about Randy's circle, but he thought that Dedra and Randy had a really good relationship. However, he couldn't be sure. For now, it didn't seem from what they gathered that Tommy had anything to do with this crime, so he was let go unless they had a reason to bring him back in later. Remember that Mark, this is Randy's son, he was put into protective custody because he was a minor. Well, of course, the investigators wanted to understand what he saw when he entered that home that night, so he was interviewed. He explained he spent the weekend at his friend's house, 16-year-old Mike Ellison, on his farm. His dad, Dale Ellison, needed help taking down this old, crumbling barn, so he enlisted the help of a few teenage boys. When Sunday came around and the weekend was over, Mark was driven back home since he had school the next morning. It seemed like a normal Sunday night. He was aware that the girls would be over there until Dedra brought them back to Tommy's house, and he expected his family to be watching TV in the living room. But when they pulled up to the house, he noticed it was pitch black. He walked up to the front door and noticed it was locked, but he had a key code to put in, so he put the code in the door, walked inside, and flipped on the lights in the foyer. But when he turned to look into the living room, he saw the figure of a man collapse next to the fireplace. Mark called out for his dad, but Randy didn't respond. And then Mark saw that trail of blood going through the living room and down the hall near the staircase, and he couldn't bear to check the rest of the house. Instead, he grabbed the cordless phone, ran out to the front yard, and dialed 911. Now I'd like to take you back to the crime scene. The medical examiner and forensic analyst worked for over 12 hours, documenting every piece of evidence that they could find. At first, they actually wondered whether this could be a situation where someone kills their family and then turns the weapon on themselves, a murder and then a self-inflicted death. Randy, Chelsea, and Chalisa all had knife wounds, but Dedra appeared to have been shot. However, when they did a more extensive examination of the scene, that theory did not explain the teeth on the couch or why there was a hole punched into the bathroom door. Someone was trying to get inside while Dedra was holding the door shut. There were also no guns found at the crime scene, and that is a big sign that it's not self-inflicted, because if you're deceased, how would you get rid of the gun? It would be near you. Plus, there were over a dozen bullet casings. Detective Hall found 2 types of shells, a medium-size .32 caliber and a larger .45 caliber, which meant there were also 2 different firearms fired. So now they thought there might be 2 perpetrators, Unless one killer used more than one weapon, plus if we include the stab wounds, it appeared there were 3 weapons used at the very least. Investigators didn't know if Randy owned guns or if this crime was premeditated and the guns were brought to this house. The knife blade back in the living room matched up with other knives in a knife set in the kitchen, so that could have been taken from the scene and used in the heat of the moment. As far as the time of death, they noticed that rigor mortis had already set in, and medical experts determined that these homicides had most likely happened more than 36 hours prior to the 911 call coming in. So they figured it was unlikely that this was motivated by the religious holiday, since it was actually Palm Sunday when police arrived on scene. But it was strange that the 2 girls had been killed with knives and that symbols had been carved into the walls. That part of it felt satanic. But now, since they had more of a timeline, they went back to speak with Mark, hoping that maybe he could provide them with some information about what his family was doing before those 36 hours. So Mark told the investigators that he was staying over Mike's all weekend, and on Saturday night, he and his friends went to see a movie. It was the movie Scream. It was actually in theaters at the time, and he still had the ticket stub. It's really eerie that he saw that movie, but back then, that was probably one of the most popular movies among teenagers. But it just seems scarier because of Mark stumbling upon what he did a day later. Mark said he wasn't sure what his family was doing since he hadn't been home since Friday. 2 of Mark's friends who had given him a ride that night came up to the police station to give their statements. Their names were Brandon Samra, who was 19, and David Cullums, who was 17. They also handed over their movie stubs from 10 p.m. on Saturday night, March 22nd. And Dale Ellison, who was one of the boys' dads, confirmed that the boys were at his house working there all weekend. It appeared the last person to see Dedra and the kids was actually Tommy Hunt, her ex-husband. Randy and Dedra's families had been contacted by this time, and they were now in the police station waiting for answers. Mark's friends comforted Kendra, and she just was in disbelief. She could not understand, like I can't and many other people can't, who would kill these 2 innocent little girls. Neighbors were crowding around the house. They wanted to know what was going on, but no one recalled hearing or noticing a disturbance that entire weekend. So, of course, they had questions. Was this domestic in nature? Was it gang violence? Pelham was considered to be a safe neighborhood, a safe city. And while there were still a lot of neighbors in denial, others were terrified to even leave their home or even go into their own backyards. Our homes are our sanctuaries. It's where we usually feel the safest and protected. So to think that an entire family was killed in such an intimate place was terrifying. On Monday, the day after Randy, Dedra, and the girls were found, the Thornsby School District was hit hard with this news. For some of Chelsea and Chalisa's little friends, this was the very first time that they've really heard about death. It's unbelievably difficult to explain to a child that they're never going to see their friend again. And counselors were there in case anyone needed support. The news of this brutal quadruple homicide spread through the community and beyond, and Pelham, Alabama became the center of national attention very quickly. There were media trucks and reporters flocking to the town, and this increased the pressure on police to solve this crime. Before I get into more of the investigation and the tips that came in, I want to cover what Dr. Joseph Embry found during the autopsies, because it's important to me for you to understand how cruel this crime was. 39-year-old Randy Duke had been shot 3 times, once in the right cheek and once in the head with a .32 caliber bullet, and once in the back left shoulder with a .45 caliber bullet. His gunshot wounds were fatal, but not immediately. Randy also had bruising and scrapes on his body and had been stabbed with a knife that was serrated between 7 to 9 times in the head and back. This contributed to the cause of his death. 29-year-old Dedra had been shot multiple times with a .32 caliber bullet, once in the side of her face, which hit her jaw and caused her to lose several teeth, and once in the arm, which traveled through her arm and into her chest, and another to her head. Her cause of death was the shot to the head. Both Randy and Dedra had been hit with 2 different types of bullets, one larger and one smaller, but both of them were jacketed, which means they were encased in a metal similar to copper and much bigger than the average size bullet. The youngest, little 6-year-old Chalisa, who was found in the primary bathroom where Dedra was blocking the door, had been cut across her throat not once, but twice, and she would have been unable to speak, yell, or even breathe. 7-year-old Chelsea, who would have turned 8 in just a couple weeks, had dozens of defense wounds. She had over 12 lacerations across her body and had been wounded 15 times on her left hand and 3 times on the right. She had 9 cuts across her face and chin and 2 to 3 across her throat, which would have caused her death. This little girl fought for her life. Not only were the victims in physical pain, but you have to imagine they were shocked and terrified, since we can speculate they witnessed people they love being killed before they had been attacked. For years afterwards, these officers could not get this scene out of their minds. Remember how I mentioned it was the bloodiest crime scene these officers had ever been to? Well, Sergeant Mark Hall explained. He said everyone in that family had been so severely injured that they had lost nearly all of the blood in their bodies. Adults have over a gallon of blood. I don't even want to think about what that house must have looked like inside. Of course, all of this family's loved ones were in shock. They were all trying to understand how something so awful could have happened and why. Randy's brother Daniel had a theory. Maybe it was because of Randy's job, and I'm not talking about his plumbing job. Remember me briefly explaining that Randy also worked for the Alabama Alcoholic Beverage Control Commission? Well, Randy's brother wondered if it could have had anything to do with this. The police ran background checks on Dedra and Randy, and Dedra had 0 connections with criminals. But Randy, he knew a lot of them. Randy specialized in the Narcotics Bureau. He was an undercover agent, which meant he was working for the government, cracking down on drugs and drug dealers. Remembering back to the 1990s, the U.S. opioid epidemic was just starting. Drugs like oxycodone, morphine, and Vicodin were being overprescribed, and even crack and cocaine were a huge issue. Randy's job was to drive out to Birmingham and go out on the streets and introduce himself as Freddie Rollins. He was supposed to be just an average guy who wanted to buy drugs. He would ask around for good contacts, and then he would rat these people out to the police. So many people in the drug scene, they were gang members, and gang violence was increasing in Birmingham. Gangs, they would, of course, use graffiti, but that's not the scary part. Certain gangs have rituals so that you can gain acceptance, performing violent acts, and sometimes even going so far as murdering other people. Once Randy had enough information to send one of these guys to prison, he was required to testify in court against them. And of course, in courts, Randy had to give his full legal name. And each time, these perpetrators would get mad. They would be furious that Freddie Rollins was a fake person and that Randy had been the one to set them up all along. Randy had enemies. And what if one of these guys got out of jail and remembered Randy? That was the person that ruined their life. So who knows what violence would come knocking at Randy's door. So investigators started studying gang symbols, and then they looked at all of Randy's undercover cases, but they didn't find any solid connections. They looked through Randy's bank records. They wondered if maybe he shopped in sketchy places or if he was in debt, but neither one was true. He didn't even owe anyone money. In the last few years, Randy had 0 large transactions, and his jobs focused on small-scale sting operations. He hadn't worked on any big-name drug traffickers. So they were back at square one, and the officers knew that time was running out if a killer was on the run. Monday afternoon, Captain Thomas held a press conference. He said they weren't going to rule out any theories on the Hunt and Duke family massacre, and if anyone in Pelham had any information, they should call the tip line. At this point, there was a $20,000 reward put up by the governor, Fob James, at the time, and tips were flooding in from neighbors, teachers, everyone, even students, and every one of them had something to say, but most importantly, they were pointing their fingers and talking about sole survivor in the family, 16-year-old Mark Duke. Individuals familiar with Mark from Pelham High School described him as a troubled kid. He was very quiet when he was younger, and he had a hard time with schoolwork, but we know what Mark was going through back then, so that's to be expected. He was having a hard time. But even as he got older, he began acting out. And after not being in Mark's life for many years, Randy was trying his best to figure out what would work for his son. He wanted to help him. However, the decision was finally made to send Mark to a boot camp, and he left Pelham High School to enroll in an alternative school. After he came back, Mark was still struggling, especially in social situations, and his grades were still low. He seemed like he was constantly angry at the world, and everyone around him wondered, was it his parents' divorce? Was it because he was being bullied? Was it mental health issues? Nobody could really pinpoint why. And there was also a lot of speculation as to why he was transferred to this alternative school in the first place. But sometimes it's just hard to deal with that teenage phase when hormones are changing and young men like Mark are dealing with a lot of emotions and feelings they've never had before. But as more information came in, investigators found out that Mark and his friend group actually referred to themselves as a gang. Interesting. They were a group of about 10 young men, and it wasn't really an organized gang. They were more like gang wannabes, and that is how most of the community kind of looked at them. 4 of the guys, Mark Duke, Brandon Samra, Mike Ellison, and David Cullums, were attached at the hip. Recall that those were the friends he went to the movies on Saturday night, and he spent the weekend over Mike's helping with his dad's barn. Well, according to those in the community, the 4 teens spent their time causing problems. However, for every accusation that came in about their supposed violence, there was also praise. Mark, Mike, and David met in middle school together at River Chase Middle School, and later all of them met Brandon at Pelham High School. David played the trombone in the school band, Mike was in a religious organization, and they thought, what motive would Mark have to kill his entire family? Investigators weren't convinced that they had anything to do with this crime, but of course they had to look into each of these boys. We already know about Mark. By March 1997, David had dropped out of high school, and one neighbor that spoke to the media described him as a typical teen. Brandon Samra, the detectives learned, had transferred to Pelham High School from out of state a year before in 1996. And like David, Brandon also dropped out of high school just 1 month before the murders. So, okay, that's more of a negative aspect of these teenagers' life, but lots of free time, bucking the system is a big stretch from murdering someone. But then the detectives got another tip. It was a man who called in, and he said that his niece told him that her friend told her, it's going to sound confusing, that her boyfriend killed his family. So, of course, if they want to know who this girl is and who her boyfriend was, her name was Sarah Woodruff. She was only 14 years old, and she was dating none other than Mark Duke. But could this be a mistake, like the game of telephone gone terribly wrong, where there's one person talking to the next person and the message just gets distorted and twisted? Mark's family was killed, but did Mark kill his family? Investigators contacted Sarah, and on the morning of Tuesday the 25th, she came into the station with her mother. Sarah told them that late on Saturday night, she was hanging out one-on-one with her boyfriend Mark at her house. And that's when she noticed that Mark had cuts on his arms. So Sarah asked where he got them and if they were from a knife. And Mark just changed the subject, and he began talking about his wild dreams that he was having. But as Sarah pried for more information, Mark said just out of the blue that he killed his entire family. Sarah thought he was joking, and I'm sitting here thinking, how is that a joke? How is that funny in any way? I don't know. But once the floodgates opened, Mark said he had gone with Brandon and Mike to Randy's house on Saturday night, and he described in detail what happened. Sarah told the police that Chelsea and Trelisa had been killed in separate rooms, and they had been murdered using kitchen knives. She said Chelsea had been dragged out from underneath the bed, and then Mark told her he ran through the woods after escaping his family's residence and gotten cuts all over his arms from the tree branches. Now, I wondered why the police had noticed these supposed scratches when they took him into the station on Sunday night. But there was no way Sarah could have known all of these details about the crime scene unless she was there or she was told by someone that was. None of this information had been released. Plus, looking back, Chief Thomas remembered something that had struck him as very odd when he first heard about Mark's 911 call. Initially, Mark told the dispatcher his family was killed and stated, "They killed my family." But when they asked him what he had seen when he walked in, he only mentioned seeing Randy lying on the living room floor and that trail of blood to the hallway. So why then would he assume the entire family had been killed? Well, Thomas had asked him about that, and he said he couldn't bear to go upstairs and see what happened. He just made the assumption because Dedra's car was in the driveway and the house was silent, and there was a blood trail going up the stairs, so he felt like his entire family had been targeted. Still, it seems strange that he wouldn't have gone to check on the others, especially the 2 children. But everyone deals with trauma differently, I guess. Mark hadn't been a suspect before, but now he was their number 1 guy. Police were still processing the evidence, and they didn't have any concrete proof that he was involved. So they needed Mark or one of his friends to confess if what Sarah was saying was true. Hillman and Thomas gave Sarah an option to wear a recording device, and Sarah agreed. And she was going to invite David, Brandon, and Mike over to her house and start asking them questions about what went down that night. The 3 guys wouldn't know that she was wearing a microphone, and the police would just be listening in this entire time, ready to respond if anything went south. All Sarah was told that she needed to do was keep the recording device on and act normal. But let's not forget, this is a 14-year-old girl. Even if it's an adult, being wired up is not only nerve-wracking, but it's very dangerous, especially if these boys are violent killers. But it's all the investigators had to go on. Sarah left the police station and went home, agreeing to wear this wire. And police were listening in. She invited her boyfriend's friends over, and they could hear the voices of these young men. But then they heard nothing because Sarah had turned it off. The next morning, the police show up at Sarah's doorstep. They ask her why she turned off the device because it couldn't have just gone off by itself. She had to manually turn it off. And she admitted, as we could have guessed, she was scared. She said if they found out she was recording, she was scared for her life. The police assured Sarah that she wasn't in danger, but can they really assure her of that? I mean, she was in danger if these guys were killers. I don't know about you, but what if the recording device lost the batteries and it started beeping or something? I don't trust technology. Plus, this was a teenage girl, as I've already mentioned, and there was a lot of pressure resting on her shoulders. Despite her fears, Sarah agreed once again to meet up with the boys, and this time she made sure to keep the mic on and recorded every word. Investigators could hear Mike and Brandon admit that they were involved in this crime, but they weren't providing any details. But now the police had probable cause to interview them separately and hopefully pit them against one another to get a full confession. Investigators still had their doubts because maybe these teens were just trying to appear cool. Remember, they're kind of wannabe gang members, but we'll find out soon enough. Mike Ellison was the first into the interrogation room, and this conversation lasted for hours. At first, he denied being involved, but then he caved, and the police recorded his entire statement of his version of the events. Mike said Mark was solely responsible for killing his entire family, that he killed Randy, Dedra, Chelsea, and Jaleesa. Mike told investigators that he, David, and Brandon, they were just in charge of driving Mark to Randy's house, but that Brandon did go inside with Mark while he and David stayed in the car. When investigators talked with David, he denied everything, but now they had Mike's confession, so they played it for him, and David said, okay, you got me. Now, he denied participating in the crime. He said he knew all the details and why Mark had done it, but David wasn't involved. He said him and Mike stayed in the car in the driveway while the massacre occurred. Finally, we've got Brandon Samra. He said he wasn't involved either. But then, once again, they played the tapes where Mike and David had snitched. So Brandon agreed to make a confession. He promised to give the police all the details. Before I tell you what Brandon told the investigators, I want you to remember what all 4 of these victims went through. I cannot imagine the pain that they were in during their last moments, but I want you to keep that in mind as you hear Brandon's confession to Chief Thomas. Brandon said that for weeks, Mark had been hanging out with his friends, talking about how much he hated his dad, and he wanted to murder him for being strict. I'm not kidding. Apparently, Mark and Randy had always butted heads. Mark resented his father for not being there for him when he was younger and everything he had to go through living with his mother the way that they did, while Randy was living the good life. Even after Mark went to live with Randy, he still resented him for sending him away to that school for troubled teens. Recently, Mark had gotten into trouble for damaging property, and he was court-ordered. He was mandated that he had to do work for the owner without payment to make up for the damage. And Mark began slacking off. He wasn't doing the work, and he told his friends that Randy was getting on his case about it, punishing him for not doing what he was supposed to do. And Mark was fed up with the way he was treated for years. On Saturday afternoon, before the boys got started on the barn that day, Mark and his friends drove over to Randy's house so Mark could ask his dad to borrow his pickup truck that evening. Mark was invited to a party, and it was about 30 minutes away, so he wanted to drive his dad's truck. He wanted to drive a sporty vehicle, maybe because it was far, and he didn't have a ride, or he just wanted to look cool. But either way, Randy said no, which is totally understandable. He's only 16. It would be late. Mark's already demonstrated he's not reliable, and he's already on thin ice due to his court order that he hasn't fulfilled. Not to mention the fact alcohol could be and probably would be involved. So Randy stood his ground. But this made Mark angry. They got into a fight, and Mark stormed out of the house and hopped into Brandon's car. And when he got in, Mark looked at his friends, and he said that tonight would be the night that he killed his dad. Then they drove back to Mike's house, and that is where Mark actually started to plan the murder. Apparently, his friends thought that he was kind of joking at first, that he wasn't really serious, but then they realized he was. Brandon asked Mark, "What are you going to do about Dedra, Chelsea, and Shalisa, who would be over there for the weekend and would most likely be there to witness the murder?" After all, these were innocent people. And Mark looked at him and said, "Well, I guess there can't be any witnesses." Wow, that's cold and heartless. Everyone thought Mark cared about these little girls, but clearly they were collateral damage for him when he's in this revenge mode against his own father. And over what? It's almost as though kids this age don't realize how good they actually have it. It's truly sad. I can't tell you why, but Brandon said that Mike agreed to provide Mark with 2 pistols. And then the men carefully wiped down the handguns of a .35 caliber and a .32 caliber and all the bullets to make sure there was no DNA or fingerprints on the guns or the bullets. And they used a black bandana to do that, a bandana that Mark had been wearing. The plan involved Mark and Brandon going inside to carry out the murders. I don't know why Brandon would agree. They all piled into Mike's car, and he drove over to Randy's, and he gave his guns to Brandon and Mark. Brandon said that before he and Mark entered the house, they discussed their game plan. Brandon would shoot Dedra, and Mark would target his father and sisters. And I can't even wrap my brain around any of this at all. Once inside, they saw Randy and Dedra watching TV while Chelsea and Shalisa were coloring with crayons at the coffee table. Mark walked up to Randy, pointed the gun at his face, and Randy pleaded for his life. At this point, Randy probably didn't think Dedra was in danger. He thought Mark just wanted to scare him or hurt him. And Randy told Mark he did not have to do this. They could resolve their differences in a peaceful way. He asked Mark what he had done wrong, but Mark just said he was tired of Randy being his boss. And then, unbelievably, Mark shot his father in the cheek. In an attempt to fight back, Randy picked up what was closest to him, which happened to be an artificial cat, which was sitting right next to him. And I don't know if you remember these or seen these. They're interactive companion cats. They purr like real cats. They kind of look like real cats. They're really popular in the late 80s. He took it and he threw it at Mark, but Mark wasn't going to back down. However, this made him miss his second shot. Brandon didn't mention shooting Randy, but Randy was shot with 2 different caliber bullets. The other one was in the back shoulders, so Brandon must have also shot Randy during this time. Mark yelled to Randy that he would see him in hell. Then he walked forward and fired his 3rd and final shot at point-blank range, hitting Randy right in the head between the eyes. At the same exact time that all this is going on, Dedra is witnessing it and panicking. She knew that she needed to get her daughters out of harm's way quickly, so she stood up and she fled. But Brandon shot at her, aiming for the side of her head. Dedra fell backward and the bullet hit her mouth, causing her to lose those teeth that fell on the couch. There was blood everywhere, and those poor little girls had just witnessed their mother and Randy get shot by someone they considered a brother. The shot to Dedra was not fatal. She was able to grab Jaleesa and she ran. Brandon did not tell Chief Thomas when and how Chelsea escaped, but at some point she made it out of the living room and ran upstairs. As Dedra ran, Brandon was shooting at her, and one of the bullets went into her arm and then through it and hit her chest. But Dedra kept going. She had that strength and that determination of a mother protecting her child. That's when she ran into the bedroom, then into the bathroom, locking herself inside and pressing herself against the door, hoping that these killers would not get to them. And oh, how I wish that they had cell phones like they do now back then, and that Dedra had one of them and she could let someone know she was in danger and get help, but she had no way of doing that. And while Mark went into the kitchen to grab a knife, I guess to make sure Randy was dead, Brandon tried to break down that door of the bathroom that Dedra was hiding in, but he wasn't strong enough. Mark then went to stab Randy, and he did this so hard that that handle on the knife broke. And when he was finally finished and he went upstairs to find Brandon, he asked, "Where's Dedra?" And Brandon pointed to the locked bathroom door. Brandon said the door was too heavy to break down. Mark tried, and he was finally able to bust out one of those panels in the door and create a hole. Mark reached in and unlocked the door and turned the doorknob. And when he opened the door, he found Dedra and Jaleesa on the floor. Brandon said that Mark put Jaleesa in the shower and he closed the curtain so she wouldn't have to see what he was going to do next. Dedra kept her face down and pleaded with these boys to let her and her daughter go. But Mark callously aimed at her forehead and told Dedra she was just as bad as Randy. She was always telling him what to do all the time. He wasn't going to let her go. Instead, he shot her in the head and ended her life. At this time, Brandon and Mark realized they'd fired all the bullets that they had, but Mark insisted he could not leave Chelsea and Jaleesa as witnesses, so they took 2 butcher knives from the kitchen, and Mark dragged Jaleesa out of the shower where she was just trying to hide. He told her that this would only hurt for a minute, and he used that knife on her neck. Next, the 2 boys went through the rooms looking for Chelsea, and they finally found her hiding under her bed. She fought hard, and Mike tried to drag her out from underneath. Both Mark and Chelsea got injuries to their hands and their body during the struggle before Mark got control of the situation and instructed Brandon to finish the job. Mark held Chelsea down by both arms as Brandon used his knife, and we know what he did. We also know that there was a black bandana near Chelsea's body and that Mark was wearing that bandana that night. Even though Brandon had already explained this, Thomas stopped him to specifically ask why they used knives on the children. And Brandon reiterated, they ran out of bullets and they had to use knives because, again, Mark said no witnesses could be left behind. Brandon, for whatever reason, was just blindly following orders from his friend. This crime is so evil and so senseless, it doesn't even seem possible. And while Brandon is relaying this to Captain Thomas, he has no emotion. There's no remorse. There's no feelings at all. He's just empty. But that's not all. After this, Brandon said they went back downstairs and Mark reached into his deceased father's pocket and stole his wallet. Then they ran to a nearby lake and they washed their hands and their clothing and they threw the knives into a storm drain and hid the guns. Then, in order to create an alibi, Brandon and Mark decided to go with Mike and David to the Hoover movie theater about 15 minutes away. They got tickets for the horror movie Scream. They only watched the movie for like a half hour, but they kept those stubs showing that it started at 10 p.m. on Saturday. Afterward, they drove to Vestavia Hills to play pool at the bowling alley, and then they stopped by Taco Bell for a late night bite to eat. It's like nothing even happened. It's beyond me how they could do something like this and just go on with their lives. Brandon told the investigators that the next day on Sunday morning, Mark went back to the crime scene and he had this brilliant idea to make it look like a gang member tried to take revenge on Randy. Mark thought if he carved these like gang signs into his bedroom, it would look like they targeted him in this rival gang to Mark's gang. Yeah, he called his friend group a gang. Brandon said that the acronym FOLKS, remember that? It actually stood for their gang name, Forever Our Lord King Satan, or followers of our Lord King Satan, depending on the day. They thought it made them look cool. I'd say that they're not cool. They're cold, yes, but cool, no. Mark wiped his fingerprints from everywhere he thought they could have been, the bathroom door, anywhere he could have touched. And then he ransacked the house to make it look like a robbery. He opened up drawers, he scattered items on the floor, clothes, and whatnot. Between carrying out this heinous crime, Mark hung out with his buddies all weekend and did everything he could to create an alibi. He hoped that someone would just randomly find his dad and Dedra and the kids. But Mark was expected to be home on Sunday, and he knew that Dedra would be expected to bring the girls back to Tommy's. So when no one found them by Sunday evening, Mark had no choice but to go back home. And he was the one that had to stumble upon the scene. And of course, he slipped up. Because he mentioned a plural, they killed his family. He said in his interview that he only saw Randy deceased. But he already knew Dedra and the girls were dead because he killed them. Brandon described the storm drain where the officers could find the 2 knives. And Captain Thomas sent officers to go look, and they were quickly recovered. And these knives hadn't even been washed. They both had dry blood and hair on the blades. After Brandon's confession, Captain Thomas and Chief District Attorney Hillman raced over to the juvenile detention center, hoping to get Mark Duke's side of the story. They told Mark that Brandon had told them the truth about what they'd done. But Mark refused to admit anything. He said, "You think I would kill my family?" And Hillman said, "Yes, actually I do." He also told him as soon as those DNA results came back, there would be evidence to prove that Mark was at that crime scene. But still, Mark refused to confess. Instead, he chose to remain silent and call his lawyer, which is his right. Of course, this frustrated Hillman because without Mark's confession, they didn't know if Brandon was making everything up, maybe even implicating Mark when he wasn't involved at all. Or what if Brandon had committed all the murders and Mark had just been an accomplice? But Mark was the one that had a real motive. So Brandon and Mark were both charged with capital murder on Wednesday, March 26th, and they were held without bond. The other 2 teens, Mike and David, were charged on 4 counts each of aiding and abetting a premeditated murder, and they were held on $1 million bond each. Now that the main members of this so-called gang folks were off the street, the neighborhood was relieved. Randy's neighbor Joe said that Pelham was still a safe place, and he was glad that the violence hadn't come from Birmingham. But Joe could not wrap his brain around a 16-year-old planning and actually carrying out this crime. Many people couldn't believe it. After the confessions, the investigators found out a little more about the teens, and by all accounts, David Lane Cullums was known to be an average student who grew troubled when his mom passed away in January that same year. It was difficult for David's dad also, and he ended up passing away 5 years after this. People who knew him said that David's reaction to his mother's death was like a typical 17-year-old. He thought he knew everything about life and how to live it on his own terms, so he dropped out of school, and that's when he started to get into trouble. Michael Lafayette Ellison was 16, and he belonged to First Priority, which is a youth group program at church. His neighbors actually referred to him as a nice and polite teenager. Brandon Samra, he was 19. He had just moved. He transferred in August to the high school, and by October, he got involved in the Folks gang, and he also dropped out of school in February. Brandon's dad, Charles, didn't want Brandon smoking weed in the house, so he actually moved out. But his dad insisted that Brandon, he was a kind and shy young man. He had some learning difficulties, and he was very gullible. He went out of his way to tell his mom how much he loved her. And this is not uncommon with criminals. I recently learned that Mother's Day has one of the lowest crime rates of the year, and that's because criminals are spending time with their moms. And that's unreal to me because they don't mind taking the lives of other people's mothers. Even Mark had fans. His friend, Jamie, said that Mark was a sweetheart. He always stood up for her. And his other friend, Jill, said that he had a heart of gold and that he loved Chelsea and Jaleesa. But this just goes to show that you can have all these positive things to say about someone, but it doesn't mean that you truly know them. Many people felt Mark was mean and he had a temper, and he was involved in a gang. But this process had just started for the Hunt and Duke families. They were still left to pick up all the pieces. Tommy's dad, Tom Hunt Sr., said that his son lost everything. His girls, their mother, his world was torn apart, and they requested the community's prayers. He said he was glad to see the Pelham PD doing such great work. He felt they should receive medals because they worked tirelessly for 3 days on no sleep and solved this case. Tommy's life was changed forever. He had to move out of his house because he had so many memories there he couldn't bear to live there anymore. I am so sorry for this father. Just please keep him in your thoughts even today, because you never get closure. It never truly gets easier. On Thursday, March 26th, a visitation was held for the families, and the funerals were on the 27th at Martin Funeral Home. Dedra and her daughters were laid to rest in the cemetery there, and Randy was buried not far away in Chestnut Creek. I was so sad when I was thinking about this, but Chelsea and Chalisa were buried together, holding hands, just like they did when they were alive. They would never be apart, with their mother buried right next to them. The investigation wasn't over yet, though. There were loose ends. Was Brandon more or less involved than he said he was? And what drove Mark to target Randy and the entire family? The hearings began to ramp up. David and Mike's attorneys felt like David and Mike were not involved. Mike had told his lawyer that he didn't provide the guns, and all 4 of the guys pleaded not guilty and actually applied for youthful offender status. That would lower the sentences to only 3 years, but thankfully, they were denied. State prosecutor Randy Owens was seeking the death penalty for both Brandon and Mark. Both men were put into high-security solitary isolation for their own safety, since they received death threats from other prisoners for killing those little girls. Owens felt the death penalty was a kindness, so they didn't have to spend the rest of their life in solitary. The handguns were recovered, and both chambers were empty, and they confirmed Brandon's story. Ballistic tests performed by an expert, Ed Morin, showed that the bullets matched the guns. The knives were tested for DNA, and they revealed Mark and Brandon's DNA and Chelsea and Chalisa's DNA. They took additional samples from Mark and Brandon to test the blood and the hair samples they found at the crime scene. And they found that Mark was in the room during the killings. Another interesting thing, Brandon said Mark had kicked the hole in the door, but Mark's footprint was not on the door. It was Brandon's. So maybe not all of Brandon's story was true. However, Mark's DNA was in the hole in the door. Brandon's trial was first in March of 1998. The Hunt family showed up to the trial wearing pink ribbons in Chelsea and Chalisa's memory, and they watched as the prosecutor made opening statements. DA Randy Hillman said that Brandon was a cold-blooded killer, and the jury would get to hear audio-taped confessions, see pictures, and even watch video recordings of the crime scene. His defense, on the other hand, said that they weren't disputing Brandon was responsible, but they were arguing he was not in his right mind at the time of the killings and he didn't deserve the death penalty. A psychologist actually testified that Brandon had anxiety and depression and what was referred to as a disorganized attachment style. But not only that, he had an IQ of only 73, which for anyone that's familiar with IQ tests, it means his reasoning ability was significantly below average. A gang expert even testified that if Brandon was part of a group that considered themselves a gang, he could easily be influenced by the other members through peer pressure. Brandon's parents also testified, and his father, Charles, apologized to the Hunt and Duke families. He said this crime was appalling and horrific. The girl's dad, Tommy, testified about the emotional and physical toll of his loss. He even said that he still loved Dedra. Their divorce did not change all the good times they had together, and now he would miss out on millions of moments with his daughters. Things like making them breakfast, tucking them into bed, doing their hair. Hillman said Brandon wasn't mentally unstable. He was apathetic. He lacked a conscience and the reasoning capabilities to even care about his victims. And in a vote of 12-0, so the entire jury recommended the death penalty. And of course, he was found guilty. Judge J. Michael Joyner sentenced Brandon to death. Now, he did apologize at the sentencing. He said he wished that he could bring the victims back and that he had found God while waiting for his trial. So hopefully he would end up in heaven. As for Mark's trial, the prosecution gave plea bargains to Mike and David so they would actually be able to testify against Mark. And in exchange, they would both plead guilty to intentional murder and hindering the prosecution and receive 16 years each. Mike and David did not end up testifying, but they still pleaded guilty and they walked away with these lighter sentences. In March of 1999, Hillman finally presented a case against Mark Duke, saying that not only would Brandon testify, but Mark's DNA was all over the crime scene. Mark's defense attorneys, John Lentine and Bill DeGrasso, said this was a rage killing fueled by trauma and that Brandon was a liar. So they were trying to say, it's not premeditated. But Brandon became the star witness and he testified to all of their actions. And we already know the details of his confession. The audience actually cried. But Mark, he didn't react at all. Hillman was actually shocked at Brandon's participation in this trial. It was the first time he had known someone on death row to testify, because this meant that Brandon would for sure lose his appeals process. He was literally sacrificing his life for the truth, and maybe it was because he found God. But the defense tried to convince the jury that Brandon was just trying to take a plea deal to get off of death row. You could see Brandon get frustrated when the defense said that. And he finally said, "No, sir, that's not true." And you could hear a pin drop. It was so quiet. Brandon said that he had made a deal, that he would be put on death row in another state so that he could be taken out of solitary isolation, because he said someone had to tell the truth, and he was the only one brave enough to come forward and say it. Mike and David didn't show up, but the prosecution did share their audio recordings. This was them in jail joking around, and you know that nothing you say in jail stays in jail. They were discussing the toilets, how long they would have to be in prison. They even complained about never getting enough sleep. But in that recording, they mentioned the 2 guns used to kill Dedra and Randy, and that they came from Mike's house. A DNA expert, Phyllis Rowan, provided more evidence that Randy's blood had been found in the kitchen, the lock on the upstairs bathroom door, and the bandana in Chelsea's room. This meant Mark had shot Randy and then gotten the knives from the kitchen and was involved in killing Dedra and Chelsea. This evidence corroborated Brandon's story. Rowan also said the bandana belonged to Mark and some of Mark's other clothes were found. Randy's blood was on his hat as well as his right Nike tennis shoe, and Dedra's blood was found on his left shoe. I think we can see that it adds up. But the defense tried to discredit Mark's former girlfriend, Sarah, and all of that she said, saying that she was on acid the night that she hung out with Mark. Still doesn't really change the fact that his friends came forward, but okay. And in another bold attempt, they tried to discredit Randy as a father. They had Randy's ex-fiancée, Donna, take the stand. That was the one that took Mark under her wing. And she talked about how Randy was always busy and he neglected Mark ever since he was a young boy. And that Mark internalized that anger and resentment until it was too much. She also claimed that Randy was an alcoholic. And when he drank, he was verbally and physically violent towards Mark. He would take him by the shoulders, shove him up against the wall, and beat him. And that Mark had to wear long shirts during the summer just to hide the bruising, which led to him getting bullied and teased at school. Dawn even said if Mark didn't do his chores, Randy would curse at him, badger him, and even make fun of Mark's speech impediment and call him names. When Donna actually confronted Randy, Donna said to the court that he would tell her to mind her own business. Now, some of this was actually corroborated by what Captain Thomas heard from Mike, which was one of Mark's friends. Apparently, Mark had told his friends that Randy laid hands on him, but nobody saw it. But all in all, the final straw was Randy not letting Mark use the car. It's not my place to judge whether or not this all happened, but it is my place to tell you the full story. We know from Randy's autopsy results that his liver was functioning perfectly at the time of his death. And experts in toxicology and pathology say the alcoholics would have excess fat cells around their livers, and Randy did not have that. So when Donna claimed that he was this raging alcoholic, that was false. And Donna never once reported any of these bad behaviors to the police. So were they as bad as she said? Did Mark in his twisted mind think that firm parenting was somehow abuse? Did his anger and resentment get so out of hand that even these innocent rules for the family seemed like personal attacks? Either way, Murder is never a solution. There are many ways to even report mistreatment if it's truly occurring. And this in no way justifies the homicide of 2 innocent children who had nothing to do with Mark and Randy's relationship. In closing statements, the prosecution reiterated that Brandon had told them everything and that the defense wanted them to believe that Brandon was a liar. But it was clear that Mark's DNA was all over that crime scene. Mark's conviction came back in 35 minutes, guilty. 10 out of 12 jurors recommended death, and you only need 10 minimum. So it met the requirements, and he was sentenced to the death penalty. But of course, there was an appeals process, and it was long. At first, the Supreme Court ruled that Mark, since he committed the crime at 16, he could be tried as an adult because these murders were especially heinous, atrocious, and cruel. But his lawyers appealed and took it to the U.S. Supreme Court. And that court ruled that any perpetrator under 18 would not be entitled to capital punishment. So he was resentenced and given life without parole instead of death. He will stay at St. Clair Correctional Facility for the rest of his life, and he is now 40 years old. I want to tell you one last thing. Brandon Samra's lawyers argued that the death penalty shouldn't apply to anyone until they turn 21. Give me your thoughts in the comments. I always like to hear what you think. And the reasoning is that that's the age where many people in the U.S. can legally drink. And the Supreme Court refused to rule on this case. Brandon was executed on May 16th, 2019. Tommy and Tara attended this execution and said it was peaceful, a peace that the Hunt and Duke family were not given in their last moments. Tommy said that he could finally move forward once all of these teens were sentenced, but as time went on, it left room for more injustices. In June of 2004, Mike and David got their first parole opportunity, and Kendra felt betrayed. She actually remembered talking to Mike the night Dedra and her family was found, and he kept reassuring her that they would find the person who did it, and all along he knew exactly who it was. She felt that these men deserved all 16 years of their sentence, and their sentences were extended, but their next hearing was set for the next year, and this went on and on and on. Mike and David were eventually released, and I have no clue where they are, what they're doing, but I truly hope that they've learned something from this, and they won't do anything like it again. In 2016, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that life without parole isn't constitutional for people who commit crimes under 18. And this meant that Mark Duke, who was sitting in jail, might be released one day. I can only imagine what these families feel like. Kendra's family struggled to celebrate Christmas for years, and she still feels like there's empty seats at the dinner table. She'll never be able to make sense of this crime or see how it's fair that Chelsea and Chalisa, who had every opportunity in the world, had their lives cut short. The Thornsby School constructed a gym in the girls' name, giving children a space to laugh and joke and play. It's the best way to honor Chalisa and Chelsea, their loving mom Dedra, and their second dad Randy, because as cheesy as it sounds, only one thing is greater than evil, and that's love. Randy and Dedra were never able to see their wedding day, but their love is the reason that these stories are intertwined. And I want to thank you so very much for being here for their stories today and supporting this channel. I hope to see you in my next video. Bye.